The night air over the Nile River was still warm even after the sun had gone down. A slow wind moved through the tall reeds along the riverbank, carrying the soft smell of wet mud, fish, baked bread, and smoke from cooking fires that had only recently faded into darkness. Small ripples crossed the black water where wooden boats rocked gently beside the shore. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then became quiet again. Most homes had already gone dark. In the narrow mud-brick streets, sandals no longer scraped across stone. Workshops stood empty. Market stalls rested beneath linen coverings. Clay jars sat cooling outside doorways after the long heat of the day. Above the sleeping city, the stars spread slowly across the desert sky like tiny silver lamps. And in that quiet ancient world, people waited for sleep in the same way people always have. Slowly. Quietly. With tired bodies and heavy eyes. Tonight, we drift into the forgotten hours of ordinary life in ancient Egypt, into a world without theaters glowing at night, without printed books beside the bed, without music pouring endlessly through crowded streets. There were no glowing screens waiting in dark rooms. No endless noise. No constant distraction. When the work of the day finally ended, people had only the night itself. And so they learned to pass time slowly. Very slowly. In Egypt, most people spent nearly every hour working. Farmers woke before sunrise when the air was still cool enough to breathe comfortably. Bakers worked beside clay ovens long before dawn. Builders carried limestone beneath the burning sun until their shoulders ached deep into the evening. Fishermen untangled wet nets beside the Nile while insects hummed over the water. Life moved according to heat, daylight, flood seasons, and exhaustion. By the time darkness arrived, many people were too tired for anything loud or energetic. The night became a place of rest, conversation, simple games, quiet music, and drifting thoughts. A man might sit outside his small home beside a flickering oil lamp, rubbing dust from his feet while listening to neighbors speak softly nearby. A mother might braid her daughter's hair beneath the stars while warm wind carried the scent of river water through the village. Children too restless for sleep might toss pebbles in the dirt or draw shapes with sticks while older relatives told slow stories from memory. Nothing hurried. The ancient world had long stretches of silence. And in those silences, people found ways to fill the hours. Far south along the Nile, where the river curved between dry cliffs and fields of barley, a farming village rested beneath the moonlight. The homes there were built close together from mud bricks dried beneath the sun. Their flat roofs held baskets, sleeping mats, broken tools, and bundles of reeds left out to dry. Inside one of these homes, a man named Hori sat beside the doorway after supper. The room behind him was dim and warm. The small cooking fire had become little more than glowing orange ash. His wife and children rested nearby on woven mats spread across the floor. A clay jar of water stood against the wall beside baskets filled with onions and grain. Hori's hands were rough from years in the fields. Even now, after washing them in river water, traces of dirt remained beneath his fingernails. His back hurt from bending over irrigation ditches all day beneath the crushing heat. Every movement felt slow. But he was not yet ready to sleep. Outside, several neighbors sat together in the narrow lane between homes. Someone spoke quietly. Another laughed softly through tired breath. An older woman hummed a tune almost too quietly to hear. Hori stepped outside and lowered himself onto a worn wooden stool. No one spoke for a while. They simply sat together beneath the stars. This was one of the oldest forms of entertainment people had ever known. Simply being near one another. The days in ancient Egypt could feel long and lonely. Farmers worked separated across wide fields. Fishermen drifted alone on dark water before sunrise. Laborers spent endless hours carrying stone in silence except for shouted instructions and scraping ropes. At night, conversation became precious. People spoke about weather, about aching knees, about stubborn donkeys, about grain supplies, about dreams they had seen while sleeping, about rumors carried downriver by traveling merchants. Sometimes stories passed through villages slowly over many months. A sailor returning from distant cities might describe strange animals, foreign temples, or enormous storms at sea. Children listened carefully, their eyes wide beneath the dim glow of oil lamps. The stories changed each time they were repeated. Details stretched and softened like old cloth. But that hardly mattered. The night itself was long. And stories helped carry people through it. In wealthier homes, entertainment looked different, though it remained slow by modern standards. In the city of Thebes, where temples rose above crowded streets and painted columns glowed red beneath the evening sun, scribes and officials sometimes gathered after dark inside shaded courtyards. Servants carried beer in clay cups. Musicians plucked strings gently on wooden harps. Perfumed oil burned slowly in small lamps. Men who spent their days bent over papyrus scrolls relaxed against cushions while soft music drifted through warm night air. Even here, life moved quietly. People played board games. They recited poetry from memory. Some listened to singers whose voices floated softly through open courtyards while servants brushed insects away with palm leaves. One of the most beloved games in Egypt was called Senet. The board itself was simple. Small carved pieces moved across painted squares according to the throw of sticks or knuckle bones. The rules changed over centuries, and historians today are not entirely certain how every move was played. But Egyptians loved it deeply. Boards appeared in homes rich and poor alike. Some were beautifully carved from ebony and ivory for wealthy families. Others were scratched crudely into stone floors or wooden boards by workers with rough hands and little money. At night, after long hours of labor, friends challenged one another beneath flickering lamps while children watched nearby. A player might pause for several moments before moving a piece. Not because the game was difficult, but because nobody hurried. Outside, the Nile flowed endlessly through darkness. Somewhere nearby, cattle shifted in sleep. A baby cried briefly inside another home before becoming quiet again. And the game continued slowly into the night. For many Egyptians, music filled empty hours. Not grand performances. Not crowded celebrations every evening. But simple human music. A woman grinding grain might sing softly to herself in steady rhythm with the stone beneath her hands. Boatmen drifting downriver sometimes sang together to keep rowing strokes even and calm. Workers returning home at sunset occasionally clapped hands slowly beside small fires while someone tapped rhythm on an upside-down clay jar. Music helped time pass. Especially during difficult labor. The fields beside the Nile demanded endless work. During flood season, the river spread rich dark mud across the land. Farmers hurried to prepare fields before planting could begin. They carried water, repaired canals, guided oxen, and bent beneath the sun hour after hour. Their bodies ached constantly. Entertainment was rarely separate from work itself. People told stories while weaving baskets. They sang while baking bread. They gossiped while washing clothing beside the riverbank. Life did not leave much room for separate leisure. And yet people still searched for moments of comfort wherever they could find them. As night deepened across Egypt, rooftops slowly filled with sleeping families. Inside homes, the heat often became unbearable after sunset. Mudbrick walls trapped warmth from the day, making the air heavy and still. Many people carried woven sleeping mats onto flat roofs where cooler wind drifted through darkness. There they rested beneath open sky. Children whispered beside parents. Someone coughed nearby. A tired worker stretched aching legs before settling onto rough linen sheets. Above them, the stars appeared brighter than most people today could ever imagine. Without city lights flooding the sky, the heavens stretched endlessly over the desert. Egyptians studied those stars carefully. Priests tracked their movement. Sailors navigated by them. Ordinary people simply watched them in silence. Sometimes entertainment meant nothing more than lying awake beside family while staring upward into endless darkness. A boy might ask questions about the gods. A grandfather might point toward familiar constellations while warm wind moved gently across the roof. Then silence returned again. Slow. Comfortable. Heavy with sleep. Farther north, near busy river ports crowded with traders and cargo boats, evenings could feel more lively. After sunset, workers gathered near beer houses where clay cups passed from hand to hand beneath smoky lamps. Bread, onions, dried fish, and beer formed the ordinary meal of many laborers. Beer was thick, cloudy, and filling. It spoiled quickly, so people drank it fresh each day. After exhausting labor beneath the sun, the cool bitterness of beer brought comfort. Conversations grew slower. Voices softened. A musician might appear carrying a flute made from reed or bone. Nearby listeners closed tired eyes while the music floated through warm air. Even these gatherings rarely became wild. Most people could not afford to lose sleep. Dawn always returned quickly. The fields waited. The workshops waited. The river waited. And so the night remained gentle. In quieter villages, elderly people often became keepers of memory. Without printed books in ordinary homes, stories lived inside human voices. Grandparents repeated old tales beside lamps while children leaned against warm walls listening carefully. Some stories told of gods traveling through the underworld at night. Others described clever farmers, dangerous spirits, or animals that spoke like humans. The same stories passed from one generation into the next for hundreds of years. Each storyteller changed small details. One village remembered a hero differently from another village farther downriver. But that was natural. Stories were alive. And in long quiet evenings, they helped people forget exhaustion for a little while. A widow living alone might spend hours spinning flax into thread while softly repeating old tales to herself from memory. A fisherman repairing torn nets beneath moonlight might sing half-forgotten songs learned from his father many years earlier. A young couple walking slowly beside irrigation canals after sunset might speak quietly about hopes for rain, healthy children, or a better harvest. Simple moments. Small moments. But precious ones. Ancient Egypt could feel brutally difficult. Summer heat pressed against skin like heavy cloth. Sand crept into homes and food. Insects buzzed endlessly near water. Illness spread easily through crowded settlements. Teeth rotted painfully from coarse bread filled with tiny grains of stone left behind during grinding. Many people died young. Bodies wore out early. Workers limped through middle age with damaged backs and swollen joints. And perhaps because life demanded so much effort, quiet forms of comfort became deeply important. Rest itself became valuable. Evening shade became valuable. Soft conversation became valuable. The sound of water against a boat at night became valuable. In one village near the edge of the desert, an old potter named Menes sat outside his workshop long after darkness covered the land. His kiln still radiated warmth from the day's firing. Rows of finished jars cooled nearby beneath linen cloth. The smell of clay and ash lingered heavily in the air. Mena no longer worked quickly. Age had stiffened his fingers. His sons handled most heavy labor now, shaping large storage jars while sweat rolled down their arms beneath the afternoon heat. Mena spent more time watching than working. At night, he often entertained himself by carving tiny patterns into broken pieces of pottery. Small birds, river reeds, fish. Simple things. His grandchildren sat nearby drawing shapes in dust while he worked slowly by lamplight. No one hurried him. The night stretched wide and calm around them. From distant homes came soft sounds of conversation, crying infants, coughing elders, and occasional laughter drifting gently through warm darkness. This too was entertainment. The simple act of making things slowly with one's hands. Across Egypt, countless evenings passed this way. A woman weaving baskets from papyrus reeds. A man carving wood beside a doorway. Children stacking stones into little towers before knocking them down again. Friends throwing sticks at targets scratched into dirt. Singers humming while grain cracked beneath grinding stones. These quiet routines filled the hours between labor and sleep. And little by little, night settled deeper over the ancient world. The Nile continued its endless journey northward through darkness. Palm trees rustled softly in the wind. Temple walls cooled after absorbing sunlight all day. Inside sleeping homes, oil lamps flickered lower and lower as families drifted toward dreams. But not everyone slept early. Some professions belonged partly to the night. Bakers often began work while stars still filled the sky. Their ovens glowed before dawn as they mixed dough in large clay bowls. The smell of fresh bread spread through streets long before sunrise touched the rooftops. Night fishermen also remained awake. Small boats drifted quietly across black water while nets disappeared beneath the surface of the Nile. Moonlight shimmered softly around them. Insects hummed close to the reeds. The river felt enormous at night, calm and endless beneath the stars. Fishing itself became a strange kind of peaceful entertainment for some men. The quiet waiting. The soft rocking of the boat. The sound of water touching wood. Hours passed slowly there. A fisherman alone on the Nile had little to do except think, hum softly, or stare toward distant lamps glowing along the shore. Sometimes that silence felt comforting. Sometimes lonely. But it was familiar. And familiarity itself brought peace. Near temple complexes, priests occasionally spent long nighttime hours observing sacred rituals or studying stars. Temples never fully slept. Incense drifted through dark halls while footsteps echoed faintly across stone floors. Young apprentice scribes sometimes fought exhaustion while copying religious texts beside dim lamps. Their backs hurt from leaning over papyrus for so many hours. Ink stained their fingers black. To stay awake, they whispered passages aloud softly to themselves. Even learning became part of how people passed time. Education was rare and valuable in Egypt. Most people never learned to read. But scribes occupied a respected place in society because writing carried enormous power. Records of grain, taxes, labor, trade, and religion depended upon them. Young scribes trained endlessly. They copied symbols again and again until movement became automatic. Sometimes older scribes entertained students with riddles or word games during quiet evening lessons. The room smelled of ink, reeds, sweat, and warm stone. Outside, darkness deepened across the city. Inside, the scratching of reed pens continued patiently into the night. Hours passed differently in the ancient world. Without clocks marking every moment, people followed softer rhythms. They watched shadows move. They noticed temperature changes. They listened for birds, insects, temple bells, or distant voices. Time flowed more slowly. And because of that, entertainment often became deeply tied to observation. People watched fires burn. They watched river water ripple. They watched clouds gather above distant desert cliffs. They watched neighbors pass through narrow streets. Life itself became something to quietly observe. In many homes, families kept small household shrines where offerings sat before painted figures of protective gods. During quiet evenings, people prayed softly, burned incense, or simply sat near flickering lamps thinking about loved ones who had died. The boundary between entertainment, reflection, and religion often blurred together. Night encouraged memory. And memory filled many long ancient evenings. Some people played with animals for comfort. Cats wandered freely through Egyptian homes, curling beside sleeping mats or chasing insects near storage jars. Children laughed softly while tossing scraps toward playful kittens. Dogs guarded homes and accompanied hunters into marshlands. Even caring for animals helped soften the heaviness of difficult lives. By midnight, most villages became almost completely silent. The fires burned low. The beer houses emptied. The storytellers grew quiet. Only insects continued singing steadily in the darkness. The Nile moved endlessly beneath moonlight beside sleeping farms and silent temples. And somewhere in that vast sleeping land, another tired worker slowly closed weary eyes after one more ordinary day in ancient Egypt. Before dawn arrived, the ancient world rested in its deepest silence. The Nile flowed like black silk beneath the fading stars. Palm leaves barely moved in the warm night air. Along narrow village paths, even the stray dogs had curled into sleep beside mudbrick walls still holding the heat of yesterday's sun. Inside small homes, families slept close together. Children shifted softly on woven mats. Someone murmured through a dream. A sleeping baby breathed against its mother's shoulder while nearby oil lamps finally burned themselves empty. The night was never completely silent in Egypt. There was always some small sound hidden inside the darkness. The creak of a wooden boat rope pulling gently against the shore. The distant cry of a bird somewhere over the marshes. The dry whisper of desert wind brushing across rooftops. The soft grinding snore of exhausted workers resting after long labor. And during these quiet hours, before the first light reached the eastern sky, many people simply lay awake for a little while. Not from fear. Not from worry alone. But because life itself moved slowly enough for thoughts to linger. A farmer might stare upward from his rooftop sleeping mat while counting familiar stars one by one. A widow listening to the river from a nearby village might quietly remember the sound of her husband's footsteps returning home years earlier. An elderly fisherman with aching knees might wake before dawn out of habit and sit beside his doorway waiting for the sky to change color. There was very little to distract the mind. And so people spent long stretches of time simply thinking. In a riverside settlement near Memphis, an old woman named Tiaa woke long before sunrise every morning. Her body no longer allowed deep sleep. Years of grinding grain had bent her shoulders forward. Her hands remained swollen from endless work. Even resting on soft linen brought pain to her joints. Still, she liked the quiet hours before dawn. She would sit outside her home wrapped in a light linen cloth while darkness rested gently over the village. Nearby, the Nile carried cool air across the sleeping fields. Sometimes she listened to frogs croaking in the reeds. Sometimes she watched small fishing boats drifting silently across the river with lanterns glowing faintly above the water. Tiaa often passed time by untangling old threads from worn clothing. Slowly. Patiently. The task required little light. Her fingers moved almost automatically after so many years. Beside her sat a small clay bowl filled with bits of thread she hoped to reuse later for mending. This kind of careful repair filled many quiet Egyptian evenings and mornings. Nothing useful was wasted if it could still serve another purpose. Clothing became patches. Broken pottery became tools or writing surfaces. Old baskets were rewoven. Sandals were repaired again and again until they nearly fell apart beneath tired feet. For ordinary people, entertainment often blended into practical work because survival required constant effort. And yet these routines could still feel peaceful. There was comfort in familiar movement. Comfort in repetition. Comfort in knowing exactly how one's hands should move without needing thought. As the sky slowly paled above the eastern desert, the first workers began stirring awake across Egypt. Bakers fed fires inside clay ovens. Temple servants swept stone floors before sunrise prayers. Water carriers lifted heavy jars onto aching shoulders. And in many homes, the earliest moments of the day carried a strange softness before labor fully began. Children still half asleep rubbed dust from their eyes. A mother kneaded dough while quietly humming an old melody learned in childhood. Someone stepped outside and stretched beneath the cool morning air before the heat returned again. Morning itself could feel almost like entertainment after the crushing exhaustion of the afternoon sun. For a short time, the world felt gentle. Birds schemed low over irrigation canals. The smell of damp earth rose from fields beside the Nile. Fresh bread crackled softly as it cooled. Workers spoke calmly before the demands of the day hardened their voices. In larger towns, markets slowly awakened beneath woven shade coverings. Merchants arranged vegetables, fish, pottery, sandals, cloth, and jars of oil upon low wooden tables. Donkeys shuffled through narrow streets carrying grain sacks. The smell of onions, mud, sweat, river water, and baking bread mixed together beneath the warming sun. And even here, amid daily work, people found small moments to pass time pleasantly. A merchant waiting for customers might carve patterns into wood with a small knife. Children chased one another between market stalls until an irritated adult ordered them away. Two workers sharing dates beneath a wall of shade might exchange stories about neighbors or complain gently about taxes and harvest conditions. Conversations wandered slowly because there was little reason to rush them. Most people in ancient Egypt spent nearly all their lives within familiar surroundings. A farmer might never travel farther than nearby villages. A fisherman might know only the riverbanks surrounding his home. News moved slowly by foot, boat, or caravan. And so ordinary gossip became deeply important. People were endlessly curious about one another's lives. Who had married? Whose donkey had wandered away? Which family received extra grain? Who had become ill? Which scribe behaved arrogantly? Who argued loudly beside the river yesterday evening? These small stories passed through villages like warm wind moving through reeds. Not dramatic. Not urgent. Just human. And human voices helped long days feel shorter. Farther south, near broad temple grounds lined with painted columns, a group of young workers rested beneath shade during the hottest hours of afternoon. The sun above Egypt could feel almost unbearable by midday. Heat shimmered above stone roads. Sand burned beneath bare feet. Workers wrapped linen cloth around their heads to shield themselves from blinding light. Even breathing sometimes felt heavy. During these harsh hours, labor often slowed. People gathered beneath trees, walls, or woven coverings while waiting for the worst heat to pass. And during these pauses, entertainment became wonderfully simple. Some men played games scratched into stone using pebbles as pieces. Others slept immediately. A few quietly sang old songs while leaning against cool walls. One worker began telling a story he had heard from a traveling sailor months earlier. The others listened lazily with half-closed eyes. The sailor, according to the story, had once traveled far beyond familiar Egyptian waters into strange foreign lands where enormous storms swallowed entire ships. The details shifted each time the story was retold. Sometimes the waves grew taller. Sometimes the monsters beneath the sea became larger. No one cared whether every detail was true. Truth mattered less than the slow comfort of listening. The workers laughed softly at familiar parts. Then silence settled again. A warm dusty silence filled with insects humming beneath the heat. Ancient entertainment often depended upon patience. There were no endless streams of new distractions waiting every moment. People returned to the same songs, the same stories, the same simple games throughout their lives. And perhaps because of that repetition, these things became deeply woven into memory. A melody learned in childhood might still be sung quietly by an old man 40 years later while repairing fishing nets beside the Nile. A grandmother might repeat the same tale hundreds of times beside evening fires. Children already knowing every word still listened carefully. Familiar stories became comforting, predictable, safe. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening, shadows stretched longer across fields and courtyards. Farmers guided tired oxen homeward through dusty paths. Workers washed sweat from their bodies beside canals. The air finally began cooling little by little. And with evening came another gentle shift in how people passed their time. For wealthier Egyptians, evenings sometimes included organized entertainment inside larger homes. Musicians played harps and flutes while guests reclined against cushions. Dancers moved slowly beneath torchlight. Perfumed oils scented the air with sweetness. But even these gatherings often remained calm by modern standards. People ate. They drank beer or wine. They listened to poetry. They spoke quietly for hours. The pace remained unhurried. In ordinary villages, evening life centered more around shared survival. Women prepared meals while smoke drifted from rooftop fires. Men repaired tools worn down during the day's labor. Children carried water jars from the river. Goats bleated softly from small fenced enclosures beside homes. And as darkness spread again across Egypt, the world slowly transformed into something softer. Cooler. Quieter. Along the Nile, groups of fishermen sometimes gathered around small fires after returning from the water. Their nets lay drying nearby while they roasted fish over glowing coals. Faces flickered orange in the firelight. Some evenings they spoke little. The exhaustion of rowing and hauling heavy nets had drained their energy. Other nights, conversation drifted gently for hours. One fisherman described strange birds he had seen deep in the marshes. Another complained about crocodiles frightening fish away from shallow water. Someone else quietly remembered a friend who had drowned during flood season many years earlier. The fire crackled softly. River insects hummed nearby. Darkness stretched endlessly beyond the glow of the flames. And little by little, the men relaxed into the comfort of simply sitting together. Companionship itself eased exhaustion. This was true across every level of Egyptian society. Humans have always needed one another during quiet nights. In crowded cities, neighbors often sat outside their homes during cooler evening hours because interiors remained hot long after sunset. Entire streets filled with soft conversation beneath the stars. An old man carved reeds into baskets. A young mother rocked a sleepy child. Teenagers whispered together at the edge of lamplight. Someone nearby pounded grain rhythmically while another person hummed in time with the sound. These ordinary scenes repeated night after night across Egypt for centuries. Not grand moments remembered by history. Not famous events carved into temple walls. But the true texture of daily life. The slow passing of time among ordinary people. Sometimes traveling entertainers arrived in larger settlements. Acrobats. Musicians. Animal handlers. Storytellers carrying tales from distant regions. Children followed them eagerly through dusty streets while adults gathered nearby after work ended. For a short while, the usual rhythm of evening changed slightly. A monkey might leap across a performer's shoulders while tired workers smiled faintly through exhaustion. A flute player might fill the night air with melodies unfamiliar to local ears. A storyteller might describe distant deserts, foreign kings, or dangerous sea voyages. Then eventually the travelers moved on. The village returned to quiet routine. And people carried those brief moments in memory for many years afterward. Memory itself served as entertainment in the ancient world. People replayed experiences repeatedly because new experiences came less often. A boy who once saw a magnificent temple festival might remember its colors for decades. A sailor who survived a terrible storm might tell the story every winter evening for the rest of his life. A woman remembering music from her wedding day might quietly hum the melody while grinding grain years later. Without constant distraction, memory remained vivid. The mind wandered backward often. Near the western desert cliffs where tomb builders lived and worked, nighttime brought special relief after the punishing heat trapped among rocky valleys all day. Workers there spent long hours cutting stone, painting walls, and hauling supplies for royal tombs hidden deep within the earth. Their labor exhausted every muscle. At night, many workers gathered outside small homes while cooler wind finally drifted down from the desert hills. Some played senet by lamplight. Others drank beer slowly while massaging sore shoulders. A few simply stared quietly toward the stars above the cliffs. One painter named Nakt enjoyed sketching little figures onto scraps of limestone during evenings after work. Tiny birds. Workers carrying tools. Cats stretching in sunlight. Boats drifting along the Nile. His drawings were quick and simple, made mostly for his own amusement. Yet they captured the ordinary beauty surrounding him every day. Art itself became a quiet way to pass time. Not only for trained artists. Ordinary people decorated bowls, furniture, tools, and walls whenever they could. Human beings naturally searched for beauty even in difficult lives. Especially in difficult lives. As darkness deepened once more, Egypt settled gradually toward sleep again. The stars turned slowly overhead. Temple fires glowed faintly in distant cities. Warm wind crossed sleeping fields heavy with grain. Inside homes, conversations faded little by little. Parents whispered softly after children finally slept. An elderly man rubbed oil into aching knees before lying down. A lonely widow listened to crickets outside her doorway while remembering voices now gone silent forever. Night after night, generation after generation, people passed time this way. Not quickly. Not loudly. But gently. And beneath the endless stars above the Nile, the ancient world continued breathing slowly in the darkness. The moon hung low above the Nile as another quiet night settled over Egypt. Its pale light touched the tops of palm trees, the edges of temple walls, and the smooth surface of the river drifting endlessly north through darkness. The fields beside the water rested after a long day of labor. Irrigation canals reflected silver lines beneath the stars. Far beyond the green farmland, the desert remained silent and still beneath cold stone cliffs. Most workers had already gone to sleep. The day had taken nearly all their strength. Yet even in the deepest hours of night, small pockets of life still moved gently through the ancient world. A baker pushed wood deeper into an oven while sparks floated upward into darkness. A temple guard walked slowly beside tall stone walls, sandals brushing softly across the ground. Two fishermen guided a narrow boat through reeds while speaking only in whispers. An old woman sat awake on her rooftop because the cool night air soothed the pain in her back better than sleep could. The ancient world never fully stopped. It simply became quieter. And in that quiet, people found countless slow ways to pass the time. Near the city of Thebes, where broad temple avenues stretched between enormous statues and painted columns, a family gathered on the roof of their home after supper. Their evening meal had been simple. Bread, lentils, a few onions, small pieces of dried fish shared carefully between them. The father leaned against the warm mud-brick wall with tired eyes half closed. His youngest son traced shapes in dust with one finger. Nearby, his daughter slowly braided strands of linen thread together while listening to the adults speak softly. No one rushed the conversation. The night air itself encouraged slowness. A warm breeze drifted through nearby alleys carrying scents from the city below. Smoke from cooking fires lingered faintly above the rooftops. Somewhere farther away, musicians played softly during a wealthy household gathering, their harp strings almost disappearing into the wind. The family listened quietly for a while. Music carried differently at night in ancient Egypt. Without constant noise surrounding it, even distant sounds became important. A flute somewhere across the city could hold a listener's attention for many minutes. The bark of a dog echoed through dark streets. The splash of an oar touching water drifted clearly from the riverbank. People noticed sounds more deeply. Silence allowed every small thing to breathe. The father finally began telling a story his own father had once told him many years earlier. It was an old story about a boatman traveling alone through heavy river fog before sunrise. Strange lights appeared above the water. Voices whispered from somewhere inside the mist. The boatman became frightened and prayed quietly to the gods while gripping his wooden oar. The children already knew the story. Still, they listened carefully. Not because they needed surprise, but because familiar stories carried comfort. The daughter smiled softly before certain lines arrived because she already remembered them. The youngest son quietly repeated favorite parts under his breath. Above them, stars covered the sky in endless numbers. And slowly, little by little, the children became sleepy listening to the gentle rhythm of their father's voice. Stories helped organize time in the ancient world. Long evenings passed through words. Entire generations remembered history through spoken memory alone. A skilled storyteller could hold attention for hours without needing anything except a calm voice and patient listeners. In smaller villages, many stories centered around ordinary life because ordinary life surrounded everyone constantly. Tales about stubborn farmers, clever servants, wandering traders, lazy workers, or unlucky fishermen spread easily from one settlement to another. Sometimes stories carried lessons. Sometimes they simply filled silence. And often the line between truth and imagination became soft and blurry over time. In a northern marsh village where papyrus reeds grew thick beside the Nile Delta, several boys sat near the riverbank after sunset skipping flat stones across the water. Their fathers had spent the day repairing fishing nets nearby. The smell of wet rope and river mud lingered in the cooling air. Mosquitoes drifted above the reeds while frogs croaked steadily from hidden pools. The boys competed quietly to see whose stone could bounce the farthest. A simple game. One that needed nothing except water, patience, and a few smooth rocks. Children in ancient Egypt invented entertainment from whatever surrounded them. They played with carved wooden animals, rag dolls stuffed with reeds, spinning tops, balls made from leather or woven plants, and tiny boats floated in shallow canals. But many games required almost nothing at all. Running races through dusty streets. Drawing shapes in sand. Throwing sticks at targets scratched onto walls. Balancing on stones beside irrigation ditches. Their laughter drifted softly across the dark water while nearby adults worked patiently beneath fading light. Even after exhausting labor, people often found comfort in watching children play. The energy of childhood briefly softened the heaviness of daily survival. In wealthier homes, children sometimes learned music during quiet evenings. Harps, flutes, lutes, and percussion instruments filled upper-class households with gentle sound after the day's business ended. A young girl practicing harp might pluck the same notes repeatedly while her teacher corrected posture and rhythm. Servants moved quietly through candlelit rooms carrying wine, bread, or bowls of fruit. The music itself remained calm. Slow melodies suited the atmosphere of Egyptian nights. Even celebrations rarely became frantic by modern standards. Life moved with the rhythm of seasons, river floods, harvest cycles, and daylight. Human bodies followed those slower patterns naturally. After sunset, exhaustion often settled deeply into muscles and bones. People became quieter not because they wished to appear disciplined, but because they were genuinely tired. A stone worker returning home after carrying limestone all day beneath blazing heat had little energy left for excitement. His shoulders burned. Dust covered his skin. His hands shook slightly from strain. And so entertainment often became restful rather than stimulating. A cool drink. A conversation. A song. A board game played slowly by lamplight. Simple comfort mattered more than thrills. Near one crowded riverside port, a group of sailors rested outside a beer house while waiting for favorable winds before continuing north. Their cargo boats remained tied beside the docks, rocking gently in black water beneath the moonlight. The men came from different regions. Some spoke with accents unfamiliar to local ears. One sailor described wide foreign rivers lined with strange trees. Another spoke quietly about dangerous storms at sea where waves rose higher than temple walls. A younger man listened with wide eyes while chewing slowly on coarse bread. The older sailors spoke without hurry. Long pauses settled naturally between sentences. The river beside them made soft slapping sounds against wood and stone. Nearby, a musician tapped gentle rhythms on a drum while smoke drifted upward from cooking fires along the shore. Travel stories fascinated many Egyptians because most people rarely journeyed far from home. The world beyond familiar villages felt mysterious and distant. Merchants and sailors carried pieces of that larger world back with them in the form of stories, songs, objects, and rumors. People gathered eagerly to listen. Not for adventure alone, but for the feeling of briefly imagining somewhere else. In temple communities, priests sometimes spent evenings discussing dreams. Dreams held powerful meaning in ancient Egypt. Many believed the gods communicated through sleep, visions, and strange nighttime experiences. Certain dreams were considered warnings. Others promised good fortune. People remembered dreams carefully. A farmer might spend half an evening describing a dream about rising flood waters while neighbors offered interpretations beside flickering lamps. A woman dreaming of birds or snakes might quietly seek advice from temple priests the next day. Without endless distractions filling every hour, the boundary between imagination and daily life remained close. Dreams mattered. Stars mattered. The movement of birds mattered. The sound of wind during the night mattered. People paid attention to small things. And in paying attention, they found endless ways to occupy the mind. Farther south, beyond busy cities and crowded temple roads, small desert communities rested in deeper silence. There, entertainment often came from watching nature itself. Families sat outside homes while sunset slowly changed the colors of distant cliffs from gold to deep red and finally purple beneath the darkening sky. Shepherds listened to goats shifting softly in their pens. Travelers arriving late shared quiet meals before sleep. The desert encouraged stillness. There was very little unnecessary movement beneath such harsh conditions. During hot months, people conserved energy carefully. Even speech became slower in the heavy heat. At night, however, the air cooled enough to bring relief. People stretched tired limbs outside their homes and breathed deeply while darkness settled around them. Some quietly carved wood or bone into small decorative objects. Others repaired sandals by firelight. Many simply sat together saying almost nothing. Modern people often fear silence. Ancient people lived inside it. Long stretches of quiet felt normal. Comfortable. Human attention moved differently in a quieter world. A worker might spend several minutes watching insects circle a lamp flame. A child might stare at moonlight reflecting on water without becoming restless. An elderly man might spend an hour slowly polishing a simple wooden tool while listening to distant nighttime sounds. Time expanded. And in that slower flow of time, ordinary moments gained weight. Near a large estate surrounded by grain fields, servants gathered together after finishing evening chores. The wealthy household behind them remained brightly lit while music drifted faintly from an upper courtyard. But outside near the servant quarters, life felt simpler. One young servant carefully braided another girl's hair while they spoke softly about the day's work. Nearby, two men played a game using pebbles arranged in circles scratched into the dirt. An older cook leaned against a wall massaging tired feet after standing beside ovens since before dawn. Someone began singing very quietly. Not a performance. Just a familiar melody carried gently into the warm night air. Others joined softly. The song moved slowly, almost like breathing. For many laborers, music existed less as entertainment and more as emotional comfort. Songs eased loneliness during repetitive work. Songs made rowing easier. Songs softened grief during funerals. Songs accompanied grinding grain, carrying water, washing clothes, and walking long roads beneath the sun. Music connected people to one another, especially during exhausting lives. As midnight approached again, Egypt slowly drifted deeper into stillness. Temple lamps dimmed. Market streets emptied completely. Animals settled into sleep beside homes and stables. Only occasional footsteps disturbed the quiet. Along the Nile, fishermen checked their nets beneath fading moonlight while cool mist gathered low over the water. Farther inland, sleeping workers turned restlessly on woven mats while warm wind crossed flat rooftops. And somewhere inside thousands of small homes, people still remained awake for one reason or another. A sick child coughing softly through the night. An elderly woman unable to sleep because of aching bones. A young couple whispering quietly about future hopes. A scribe finishing work beside a nearly empty oil lamp. A lonely guard staring toward dark desert hills while fighting exhaustion. Human life continued gently beneath the stars. Night after night. Year after year. Century after century. And across all those generations, people kept searching for simple ways to make the long quiet hours feel softer, calmer, and a little less lonely beside the endless river flowing through the ancient dark. The hours just before dawn often felt the quietest of all. By then, most fires had faded into ash. The night wind cooled the walls of mud-brick homes. Even the insects near the river grew softer, their endless humming slowing beneath the pale light of the moon. The Nile continued moving through darkness without rest. It slipped past sleeping villages, temple docks, silent fishing boats, and empty fields waiting for morning labor to begin again. The river had watched countless generations live and disappear along its banks. Farmers, bakers, servants, fishermen, children, scribes, stone workers, merchants, mothers, and tired old men had all sat beside these same waters at night, listening to the same gentle sounds. And in every age, people searched for ways to fill the slow spaces between work and sleep. In a village surrounded by barley fields, a young farmer named Painasy rested awake beside his older brother on the roof of their family home. The air felt cooler now. Above them, the stars shimmered clearly across the open sky. Their sleeping mats lay close together near a low wall where bundles of dried reeds had been stacked earlier that evening. Nearby, their father snored softly beneath a linen cloth while their mother slept beside the younger children. Painasy was not tired yet. His body was exhausted, but his mind still wandered. This happened often after long days in the fields. The body slowed faster than the thoughts. His brother quietly carved small shapes into a scrap of wood using a bronze knife worn smooth from years of sharpening. Tiny curls of wood gathered near his knees. He worked without speaking for several minutes. Finally, Painasy asked what he was making. "A bird," his brother answered softly. Painasy nodded even though the carving still looked rough and unfinished. That was enough conversation for a while. Silence returned naturally. Below them, somewhere in the dark village lane, sandals scraped softly across stone. A donkey shifted beside its tether. Then everything became still again. The brothers remained awake mostly because there was nowhere else to go and nothing else demanding their attention. And so they sat beneath the stars letting time pass slowly around them. This was one of the great differences of the ancient world. People were rarely surrounded by constant stimulation. Many evenings contained long empty stretches where nothing happened at all. No performances. No urgent news. No endless distractions. Only darkness, weather, memory, conversation, and the quiet movement of human thought. For some people, this slowness felt peaceful. For others, lonely. But everyone knew it well. In larger Egyptian towns, rooftop life became especially important during hot seasons. Entire families carried blankets, mats, water jars, and pillows upward after sunset to escape the trapped heat inside their homes. From above, the rooftops almost formed another city. Soft voices drifted through darkness from family to family. A mother sang quietly to calm a restless infant. Two elderly neighbors discussed harvest conditions across a narrow alleyway. Teenagers whispered together beneath the stars while trying not to wake sleeping relatives nearby. Sometimes people watched distant torchlight moving slowly through temple grounds far across the city. Other nights they simply listened to the wind. Children often stayed awake longer on rooftops because the open sky fascinated them. Without smoke or artificial light hiding the heavens, the stars appeared sharp and endless. Bright constellations stretched from horizon to horizon over Egypt. Young children asked questions constantly. Which star belonged to the gods? Why the moon changed shape? Whether dead relatives lived somewhere beyond the sky. Adults answered gently when they could. Sometimes they invented answers. Sometimes they admitted they did not know. Either way, these quiet conversations helped carry the night forward. Near the river docks of a busy trade settlement, several merchants remained awake counting supplies by lamplight. Their boats would depart at sunrise carrying grain, pottery, linen cloth, and jars of oil northward along the Nile. The men sat cross-legged beside stacked cargo while scribes carefully marked records onto papyrus sheets. Even accounting could become strangely calming during late-night hours. The scratch of reed pens, the flicker of oil flames, the distant sound of water touching wooden boats. Everything moved patiently. One merchant occasionally paused to stretch his stiff back before sipping beer from a clay cup. Another stared blankly toward the dark river for a few moments before returning to his counting. Long workdays often blurred together this way. Tasks repeated endlessly until routine itself became almost comforting. Many people passed time through repetition. The same songs. The same games. The same evening routines. The same prayers before sleep. Familiar habits gave shape to difficult lives. In a small home near Memphis, an elderly scribe named Jehudimos spent his evenings copying old wisdom texts for younger students. His eyesight had weakened with age, forcing him to hold papyrus close to the lamplight. Still, he enjoyed the work. The quiet concentration soothed him. Outside his doorway, the city slowly settled into sleep while he continued tracing careful symbols line by line across smooth papyrus. Sometimes students visited after sunset to practice reading aloud beside him. Their young voices stumbled over difficult passages while the old scribe corrected them patiently. When lessons ended, the students often remained a little longer simply listening to him speak. Older people carried valuable memory in Egypt. Not only practical knowledge, but stories, songs, family histories, ancient sayings, knowledge of floods, droughts, illnesses, and distant years already fading from public memory. Aging scribes, sailors, priests, and craftsmen became living libraries. And many evenings passed with younger people gathered nearby listening quietly while elders remembered the past. Outside, darkness deepened across the city. A warm breeze carried the smell of river mud and smoke through narrow streets. Cats wandered silently between homes searching for scraps. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played briefly and then stopped. Jehudimos paused his writing and rubbed his tired eyes. Then he began reciting an old teaching from memory. The students listened carefully. Not because the words were exciting, but because calm voices in warm lamplight brought comfort at the end of long days. In farming communities, many people entertain themselves by observing ordinary life around them. Humans naturally study one another when time moves slowly enough. A woman washing clothing beside the river might spend an hour quietly watching boats drift past. An old fisherman repairing nets might observe birds circling above shallow water. Children sitting beside irrigation canals watched insects skate across the surface while mud dried slowly on their feet. People became deeply familiar with small patterns. The changing smell of river water during flood season. The sound of approaching sandals on different kinds of stone. The way heat gathered inside rooms before sunset. The rhythm of neighbors returning home after work. Nothing seemed too small to notice. Because life contained enough quiet for noticing. Farther south near desert cliffs, a group of laborers rested after transporting stone blocks all day beneath brutal heat. Their camp stood near unfinished tombs carved into rock. Dust covered everything. Their skin. Their clothing. Their sleeping mats. Even their food tasted faintly of sand. After supper, several workers gathered around a low fire while one man slowly played a simple tune on a reed flute. The melody drifted softly through the dark valley. No one applauded. No one demanded another song. The music simply existed beside the firelight and cool night wind. One worker closed his eyes while listening. Another stretched sore legs toward the warmth of the flames. A younger laborer quietly tossed pebbles at a line scratched into the dirt, trying to land them as close as possible without crossing it. A tiny game. Simple enough to continue for an hour. Ancient entertainment often relied upon repetition because repetition matched the rhythm of labor itself. The same fields planted every year. The same nets repaired each season. The same river routes traveled again and again. The same prayers spoken each morning and night. People did not always search for novelty. They searched for familiarity. For comfort. For brief moments of ease inside difficult routines. As the night grew later, conversations around the fire became slower. Long pauses settled naturally between sentences. Nobody felt pressure to keep speaking. Silence itself belonged comfortably among friends. Eventually one laborer began describing a festival he had attended years earlier in Thebes. Torchlight reflected on temple walls. Musicians filling crowded streets. Perfumed oil burning in enormous braziers. Priests carrying sacred statues through cheering crowds. The others listened quietly. Most had never seen such celebrations themselves. For workers living in isolated labor camps, stories from distant cities became treasured entertainment during long nights. Memory carried people far beyond the places where their bodies remained trapped by work. Across Egypt, countless elderly people spent evenings teaching practical skills to younger family members. Grandmothers showed girls how to spin flax into thread. Fathers taught sons how to repair tools, tie fishing knots, or shape clay jars. Learning happened slowly. Patiently. Hands guided other hands through familiar motions repeated across generations. There were no formal lessons for most ordinary people. Knowledge passed quietly through shared labor. And often these lessons unfolded during the calm hours after sunset when work finally slowed enough for conversation. Near one riverside village, a grandfather sat beside his grandson mending a fishing net beneath moonlight. The old man's fingers moved confidently despite age and stiffness. The boy struggled to copy the knots correctly. Again and again he made mistakes. Again and again the grandfather patiently untangled the rope and showed him once more. The river lapped softly nearby. A cool wind moved through tall reeds. Farther down shore, someone sang faintly while rowing across dark water. The lesson continued slowly into the night. No one hurried. Time itself seemed wider then. More open. Even boredom carried a different feeling in the ancient world. People expected empty hours. They accepted them. A shepherd watching goats beneath the afternoon sun might spend hours alone with nothing except drifting thoughts and distant wind across dry grass. A guard standing outside storage buildings through the night learned to observe tiny details simply to remain alert. Humans adapted to slowness. They learned to rest inside quiet moments instead of constantly escaping them. And perhaps that is why even simple things became meaningful. A cool drink after heat. A familiar voice after loneliness. A song heard from across the river. A gentle breeze entering a crowded room. A story repeated 100 times. These small comforts carried enormous value. Near dawn once more, Egypt settled into that strange stillness between night and morning. The stars slowly faded. The eastern sky softened toward gray. Roosters stirred somewhere beyond sleeping homes. Workers would wake soon. The ovens would glow again. The fields would fill with labor. But for a little while longer, the ancient world remained wrapped in quiet darkness. And beside the endless Nile, countless ordinary people rested, talked softly, watched the stars, repaired tools, remembered old stories, and let the slow peaceful hours carry them gently toward sleep once again. A faint gray light slowly touched the eastern horizon. The stars above Egypt began disappearing one by one, fading softly into the coming dawn. Along the Nile, thin morning mist drifted low over the water while reeds swayed gently beside the riverbank. The world still felt half asleep. This quiet moment before sunrise belonged to workers. Soon the day would grow loud with labor. Donkeys would bray in crowded streets. Bakers would shout to apprentices beside hot ovens. Stonecutters would raise heavy tools beneath the sun. Boats would push away from muddy shores carrying grain, fish, pottery, and linen along the river. But not yet. For now, there was only the cool air, the dark river, and the slow waking of the ancient world. In a farming village north of Thebes, a woman named Henut sat outside her home grinding grain before dawn. The stone beneath her hands moved in steady circles. Soft scraping sounds drifted through the quiet lane while her children still slept inside. She had performed this same task nearly every morning since childhood. The movement no longer required thought. Her hands worked automatically while her mind wandered elsewhere. This was how many people passed time in ancient Egypt. Not by stopping work completely, but by allowing the mind to drift gently during repetitive labor. Henut watched the sky brighten little by little while she worked. Birds began calling near the river. A neighbor stepped outside carrying empty water jars. Somewhere nearby, a baby started crying. The village slowly stretched awake. And even inside these ordinary routines, people found small spaces for thought, memory, and quiet entertainment. Henut often recited old songs silently to herself while grinding grain. Not because anyone was listening. Simply because the rhythm helped the work feel softer. Many laborers did this. Boatmen sang in time with their rowing. Weavers whispered stories while threading looms. Field workers repeated simple melodies while harvesting crops beneath the sun. Songs helped measure time. Without clocks dividing the day into exact pieces, rhythm became important. The body itself learned the pace of work through repeated sound and movement. Near the river docks, fishermen prepared their boats beneath fading moonlight. They untangled wet nets carefully while speaking in low tired voices. Their fingers smelled of river water and fish scales. Small lanterns flickered on the shore beside piles of rope and woven baskets. One older fisherman sat quietly sharpening a bronze hook with slow patient strokes. He did not join the conversation much. Instead, he listened. To the river. To the wind. To younger men speaking nearby. Listening itself filled many ancient evenings and mornings. People spent far more time simply hearing the world around them. The splash of fish near reeds. The sound of sandals approaching from far away. The low murmur of neighbors speaking through thin walls. The crackling of cooking fires. The slow breathing of sleeping relatives during the night. In quieter worlds, the ear becomes sensitive. Small sounds carried meaning. As sunrise spread across the Nile Valley, warm gold light touched temple walls and flooded narrow streets between mud-brick homes. Workers moved steadily toward fields and workshops while dust slowly rose beneath their feet. The day had begun again. And with it came another long cycle of labor. Yet even during working hours, people still searched for ways to ease boredom and exhaustion. Children often played nearby while adults worked. In farming villages, boys chased one another through irrigation ditches while parents planted crops. Young girls made dolls from scraps of cloth and papyrus reeds while sitting beside mothers weaving baskets or preparing food. Childhood entertainment grew naturally from the world surrounding them. Mud became toys. Stones became game pieces. Reeds became boats floating through shallow water. Nothing needed to be expensive or elaborate. Imagination carried most of the work. In larger towns, craftsmen sometimes entertained apprentices with stories during long hours inside workshops. Potters shaping clay jars spoke about strange customers or difficult market days. Carpenters joked quietly about stubborn donkeys blocking narrow roads. Jewelers repeated stories about wealthy officials demanding impossible work. The workshop smelled of sweat, sawdust, clay, smoke, oil, and heated metal. Tools scraped steadily against stone and wood. Sunlight entered through narrow openings high in the walls, cutting thin bright lines through dusty air. The work itself could become hypnotic. A weaver passing thread through a loom hour after hour often slipped into deep thought. Potters shaping spinning clay sometimes hummed softly without realizing it. Scribes copying long records onto papyrus entered quiet states where time seemed to loosen and drift. People became skilled at existing inside repetition. It was necessary. Most tasks in ancient Egypt repeated endlessly throughout life. One season followed another. Flood. Planting. Harvest. Dry months. Then flood again. The river decided everything. And during long stretches of familiar routine, human beings naturally created small comforts to soften the passing years. Near midday, heat pressed heavily across the land. The air above roads shimmered. Stone walls burned warm to the touch. Animals searched for shade beneath trees and woven shelters. For many workers, the hottest part of the day brought slower movement and brief periods of rest. In one village beside the Nile Delta marshes, several farmers gathered beneath a sycamore tree during the afternoon heat. Their clothing clung damply to their skin after hours in flooded fields. Nearby, dragonflies hovered above irrigation water while insects hummed lazily in the still air. One man chewed slowly on bread and onions while another stretched aching legs across the dirt. Conversation drifted without direction. Someone mentioned a wedding planned for next month. Another complained about sore shoulders from carrying water jars. An older farmer described unusually large fish caught years earlier during flood season. The younger workers listened quietly. Stories often emerged naturally from exhaustion. When bodies became too tired for activity, voices took over. And so countless afternoons passed with ordinary people sitting together beneath shade while heat settled heavily over Egypt. Even silence between friends became valuable. There was comfort in resting beside others without needing constant conversation. Nearby, one young farmer traced game patterns into the dirt using a stick. Soon another joined him. They began tossing date pits toward the markings while the others watched lazily from the shade. Tiny games like this appeared everywhere across the ancient world. Simple competitions. Small challenges. Passing moments. Entertainment rarely needed preparation. It simply rose out of boredom, waiting, and human curiosity. Farther south near the great temples, musicians practiced during the quieter afternoon hours before evening ceremonies. Harps rested against painted walls. Flutes lay beside baskets filled with reeds and tuning tools. Drum skins tightened slowly beneath the dry heat. Music held deep importance in Egypt. Not only during celebrations or rituals, but throughout ordinary life. Temple singers practiced hymns. Laborers sang while hauling stone. Mothers hummed children to sleep. Boatmen used rhythm to guide rowing. Even funeral processions carried slow mournful melodies through dusty streets. Music shaped emotional life in ways both large and small. A familiar melody could calm fear during storms on the river. A gentle tune drifting from a nearby home at night could ease loneliness. Songs connected people to memory. Many elderly Egyptians carried songs from childhood deep into old age. Even when bodies weakened and eyesight faded, melodies remained clear in the mind. Near sunset, life softened once more. The brutal heat slowly loosened its grip over fields and roads. Workers returned home covered in dust and sweat. Water jars emptied quickly. Cooking fires appeared across rooftops and courtyards. Evening meals remained simple for most families. Bread, beer, onions, beans, fish when available. Sometimes dates or figs. Families gathered close together while darkness slowly returned to the Nile Valley. These evening hours became deeply important because they offered rare freedom from constant labor. A young mother might finally sit down after carrying water, preparing food, cleaning, weaving, and caring for children since before sunrise. An elderly laborer might soak aching feet in cool water while listening to younger relatives speak nearby. And once again, people searched gently for ways to pass the night. In one crowded street near Memphis, neighbors gathered outside their homes after supper while cooler air drifted through the city. Lamps flickered beside doorways. Cats prowled quietly between baskets and sleeping dogs. A storyteller arrived carrying nothing except a walking stick and a tired voice. Still, children gathered around him immediately. Adults smiled softly and settled nearby. The storyteller began describing a traveler lost in the desert beneath a moonless sky. Strange lights appeared among distant dunes. Wind whispered through empty ruins. A hidden well waited somewhere in darkness. The children listened with wide silent eyes. The adults listened too, though more calmly. Many had already heard versions of the tale before. But stories were not always about surprise. Sometimes people listened because the familiar rhythm of storytelling felt peaceful after difficult days. The storyteller spoke slowly. Long pauses rested naturally between sentences. The listeners watched shadows flicker across the dusty ground while warm night air drifted through the street. No one hurried him. The night was long. And there was comfort in simply sitting together beneath the stars while words carried everyone gently away from the exhaustion of ordinary life. Far above them, the moon rose slowly over Egypt once again. Its pale light touched temple towers, quiet riverbanks, sleeping fields, and endless stretches of desert stone. The Nile continued moving patiently through darkness. And beside it, generation after generation of ordinary people kept finding small gentle ways to soften the long hours between labor and sleep. Night settled once again across the Nile Valley with slow and familiar calm. The last orange light faded from the western desert cliffs. Shadows stretched across temple courtyards and narrow village paths. One by one, small oil lamps flickered to life inside homes built from mud brick and river clay. The heat of the day still lingered in the walls. Warm air drifted slowly through open doorways carrying the smell of cooked lentils, smoke, baked bread, damp reeds, and the faint sweetness of date fruit left drying on woven mats. Across Egypt, workers rested their tired bodies after another long day beneath the sun. And once more, the quiet hours began. In a small riverside settlement surrounded by papyrus marshes, a family gathered outside their home beside a low cooking fire. The flames had already weakened into glowing red coals, but nobody wished to sleep yet. The father sat repairing a fishing net stretched across his knees. The mother leaned against the wall carefully peeling reeds for basket weaving. Their youngest child rested sleepily against her shoulder while the older boys tossed smooth stones toward a broken clay jar placed several steps away in the dirt. The game was simple. Each boy tried landing the stone through the narrow opening without knocking the jar over. Misses were common. Nobody seemed bothered. The pleasure came from trying again. Ancient entertainment often unfolded this way. Small repeated actions. Simple goals. Gentle competition without urgency. The boys laughed softly whenever a stone bounced away into darkness. Nearby, their father smiled without looking up from his work. The river behind the homes moved quietly beneath moonlight. From farther downshore came the distant sound of another family singing together while washing cooking bowls in the Nile. Everything felt slow. Comfortably slow. In larger cities like Thebes or Memphis, evenings carried more sound, though still far softer than modern life. Merchants closed market stalls beneath hanging lamps. Temple workers swept courtyards before night prayers. Travelers searched for resting places while donkeys shifted wearily beside loaded carts. And through it all drifted human voices. Low conversations. Laughter softened by exhaustion. Murmured songs. Stories repeated for the 100th time. People in ancient Egypt spent enormous amounts of time talking quietly together. Without endless distractions competing for attention, conversation became one of the great comforts of ordinary life. Neighbors knew one another deeply. Families shared nearly every hour together. Workers spent entire seasons beside the same companions in fields, workshops, or boats. Human relationships grew slowly through repetition and closeness. A fisherman knew the sound of his friend's footsteps approaching long before seeing him. A mother recognized neighbors simply by the rhythm of their voices through thin walls at night. A scribe could identify co-workers from the scratching pace of their reed pens across papyrus. Life unfolded at close distance. And so companionship mattered deeply. Near the temple district of Karnak, several young apprentices rested beside a stone wall after finishing evening duties. Their white linen garments remained dusty from cleaning floors and carrying supplies all afternoon. One apprentice traced shapes onto the ground with a stick while another leaned back against the wall watching bats circle above the courtyard. An older student began reciting humorous lines from a well-known wisdom text. The others smiled quietly. The lines were familiar to all of them. Still, they repeated them together from memory beneath the warm night air. Education in ancient Egypt depended heavily upon memorization. Students copied passages repeatedly until words settled permanently into the mind. Many young scribes could recite long sections of teachings, prayers, and stories without looking at written texts. And during quiet evenings, they often entertained themselves by testing one another's memory. One student spoke the beginning of a line. Another completed it. Then another added the next part. The game continued slowly beneath the stars. Nearby, temple lamps glowed faintly against enormous carved columns. The scent of incense drifted gently through the dark. Farther away, musicians practiced soft ceremonial music inside the temple grounds while insects hummed beyond the walls. Even places built for worship held ordinary moments of boredom, companionship, and passing time. In farming villages, evenings often became busiest during harvest seasons. After sunset, families gathered together to sort grain, prepare storage jars, mend baskets, and organize supplies before sleep. The work continued long into the night because harvest time determined survival through the coming months. Yet even during these exhausting evenings, people still found small moments for comfort. A grandmother shelling beans might begin telling childhood memories without anyone asking. A young boy stacking grain sacks might suddenly start singing simply to make the work feel lighter. Someone nearby would eventually join him. The rhythm of shared labor softened exhaustion. People rarely worked completely alone if companionship could be found. Near one riverside dock, a ferryman named Nebamun sat beside his boat after carrying travelers across the Nile all day. His arms ached from rowing against the current. The skin on his hands had hardened like dry leather after years gripping rough wooden oars. Still, he remained awake beside the water. He enjoyed these quiet hours after work ended. The river felt different at night. Cooler. Wider. More mysterious beneath moonlight. Nebamun often passed time skipping bits of broken pottery across the dark surface while listening to nighttime sounds drifting from nearby villages. A dog barking far away. Water birds moving through reeds. Laughter carried across the river by wind. Sometimes he spoke softly with other ferrymen resting nearby. Other nights he preferred silence. The simple act of watching water became enough. Ancient people spent much of their lives observing nature closely because nature controlled survival so completely. They noticed cloud patterns, bird movements, river levels, wind direction, the smell of rain carried from distant regions. Watching the world itself filled many quiet hours. In the western desert beyond cultivated land, caravan travelers rested beside small fires beneath endless stars. Camels and donkeys lay quietly nearby while guards remained awake watching the darkness. Travel through the desert moved slowly and carefully. During long journeys, entertainment became especially important because the landscape changed very little day after day. Travelers told stories constantly. They described strange towns visited years earlier. Dangerous sandstorms survived by luck. Bandits encountered along lonely roads. Unusual dreams seen during feverish nights in the heat. One old merchant traveling northward entertained younger companions by describing an enormous crocodile he claimed to have once seen near the southern Nile. Each time he told the story, the animal grew slightly larger. The younger travelers listened patiently beside the fire. Perhaps they doubted parts of the tale. But that hardly mattered. Stories belonged to the night itself. And the desert night encouraged storytelling better than almost anywhere else in Egypt. Beyond the firelight stretched complete darkness. Above, the stars looked close enough to touch. The wind moved softly across sand and stone. Human voices felt warm against such vast silence. Back in the cities, some wealthier Egyptians spent evenings playing music, drinking wine, and enjoying formal gatherings. Painted banquet scenes found inside tombs show guests reclining comfortably while musicians performed nearby and servants carried food between tables. Yet even these gatherings unfolded slowly. People talked for long periods between songs. Music drifted gently rather than constantly. Guests sometimes played board games or listened to poetry recited aloud. Nothing moved quickly. The pace of life itself discouraged hurry. Oil lamps provided only limited light. Human bodies grew sleepy not long after darkness settled fully. Most labor still depended upon sunrise. Eventually, even wealthy homes quieted. Servants extinguished lamps one by one. Musicians packed away instruments. Guests departed through dark streets beneath the moon. And Egypt gradually returned to stillness again. In one narrow alley near Memphis, an elderly woman sat awake outside her doorway spinning flax into thread while most neighbors slept. Her spinning tool moved steadily through her fingers with practiced ease. Nearby, a tiny lamp flickered beside a basket of unfinished fiber. She had performed this task for so many years that the motion almost felt separate from conscious thought. Her mind wandered elsewhere. Toward old memories. Toward people already gone. Toward seasons long past. This too was part of how ancient people passed time. Memory-filled silence. Without constant interruption, the mind naturally drifted backward through life. An old man watching river water at night might remember childhood fishing trips beside the same shore. A widow hearing certain songs might quietly return in thought to her wedding day decades earlier. A tired laborer staring into firelight might think about parents, friends, or children sleeping nearby. Human memory moved gently through the quiet hours. Sometimes comforting. Sometimes painful. Often both at once. As midnight deepened, cooler wind finally crossed the land. Palm leaves rustled softly in the darkness. Sleeping animals shifted inside small pens beside homes. The river reflected long silver paths beneath the moon. And still, scattered across Egypt, people remained awake. A baker preparing dough before dawn. A mother soothing a feverish child. Temple guards walking slowly through silent courtyards. Sailors watching tide boats rock gently against wooden docks. Workers resting sore feet after endless labor. Young lovers whispering softly on rooftops beneath the stars. An old fisherman listening to water move through reeds. The ancient world breathed quietly through the night. Not empty. Not lonely. But calm. Filled with small ordinary lives passing slowly beneath the endless sky beside the Nile River. The Nile carried the night gently forward. Its dark waters slipped past sleeping villages, silent temple walls, abandoned fishing docks, and long stretches of farmland resting beneath the moon. Along the riverbanks, reeds whispered softly whenever the wind shifted. Frogs croaked from hidden pools. Somewhere far away, an owl called once into the darkness and then fell quiet again. Egypt rested beneath a pale silver sky. Most homes had gone dark hours earlier, yet faint signs of life still remained scattered across the land like tiny glowing embers refusing to disappear completely. A small lamp burning behind a woven curtain. A rooftop conversation continuing softly into the night. A fisherman's lantern drifting slowly along black water. A baker's oven glowing before dawn. The ancient world slept lightly. And through those long peaceful hours, people continued finding gentle ways to occupy their minds and ease their tired hearts. Near a narrow canal branching from the Nile, a young shepherd named Kimwazet sat awake beside a small enclosure filled with goats. He had spent the day guiding the animals across dry grassy land beneath heavy heat. Dust still clung to his sandals and the edges of his linen clothing. Now, with the animals finally quiet, he rested on a flat stone beside a dim fire. The flames had nearly died. Only glowing coals remained. Kimwazet used a stick to slowly draw shapes in the dirt while staring absent-mindedly toward the stars. Circles. Lines. Tiny boats. Animal figures. Then the wind erased them little by little. This kind of quiet aimless activity filled many ancient nights. People often worked with their hands even while resting. Carving wood. Braiding reeds. Polishing tools. Repairing sandals. Tracing patterns in sand. Movement itself felt comforting after long familiarity. Nearby, one of the goats shifted in sleep, its small bell making a faint sound in the darkness. Kimwazet listened for a moment and smiled tiredly. Then silence returned again. The stillness of the ancient night could feel enormous. Without constant lamps or noise, darkness spread widely across the land after sunset. Entire villages disappeared into shadow except for a few scattered points of firelight. People learned not to fear this darkness completely. They lived inside it. Children grew up recognizing familiar nighttime sounds. Workers walked home beneath moonlight often enough to know every curve of nearby paths. Boatmen guided themselves across the river using stars reflected on black water. Night became another kind of world rather than simply the absence of day. And inside that world, human attention changed. People noticed softer details. The smell of cool river mud after heat faded. The feel of wind moving across rooftops. The distant rhythm of rowing from unseen boats. The warmth of another person sitting nearby in silence. Near Thebes, several women gathered together on a rooftop after finishing evening chores. Large baskets filled with flax rested beside them while their fingers twisted fibers into thread beneath lamplight. The work moved slowly but steadily. One woman spoke quietly about her sister's upcoming marriage. Another described a dream she had seen 2 nights earlier involving birds circling above flood water. An older woman occasionally corrected the younger girl's spinning technique while smiling softly at their mistakes. The rooftop overlooked narrow streets where most homes had already fallen silent. Only a few dogs wandered below searching for scraps near the darkened market stalls. The women continued spinning and talking for hours. Their conversation wandered gently from one subject to another without urgency. Family news. Weather. Children. A neighbor's illness. The price of grain. Old memories from years earlier. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary life spoken aloud beneath the stars. And perhaps that was one reason these conversations mattered so much. Daily life in ancient Egypt demanded enormous physical labor. Bodies grew exhausted. Days repeated themselves endlessly with little change. Talking together softened that heaviness. Human voices made difficult lives feel shared instead of lonely. In temple towns, priests sometimes organized quiet evening gatherings centered around music and religious stories. These were not always grand ceremonies. Often they were calm moments where small groups sat listening to hymns while incense drifted upward through warm air. Music inside temple walls sounded different from ordinary village singing. The stone halls created long soft echoes. Harp notes lingered. Flute melodies floated gently through torch-lit corridors. Listeners closed their eyes while the sounds filled the darkness around them. For many Egyptians, spiritual comfort blended naturally with entertainment. Listening to sacred stories. Watching ceremonial processions. Hearing hymns sung beside temple fires. These experiences eased fear and uncertainty inside lives shaped constantly by illness, floods, drought, injury, and hard labor. Religion offered emotional rest as much as worship. Farther north near the delta marshes, children still remained awake inside one crowded family home. The night air felt too warm for sleep, and the youngest boy kept asking for another story. Their grandfather finally sighed with tired amusement and began speaking from his sleeping mat near the doorway. He told them about a lazy crocodile who tricked fishermen into feeding him for many years by pretending to be a sacred creature blessed by the gods. The children laughed softly. They had heard the story before. Many times. Still, they listened carefully while shadows flickered across the walls from the oil lamp nearby. Ancient storytelling often relied heavily upon repetition. People returned to familiar tales the way they returned to familiar songs or prayers. The comfort came partly from already knowing what would happen. In uncertain lives, predictability itself became soothing. The grandfather paused often while speaking. Not for dramatic effect. Simply because older voices grew tired. The children waited patiently during the silences. Outside, warm wind drifted through reeds near the riverbank. The smell of water entered softly through the doorway. Eventually, one child fell asleep before the story ended. Then another. Until finally only the old man remained awake staring quietly at the fading lamp flame beside him. Near a busy river port, sailors waiting for favorable winds passed part of the night gambling with small carved pieces of bone and stone. They crouched beside cargo baskets under a hanging lantern while tide boats knocked gently against wooden docks nearby. Their game was simple. Throws. Guesses. Small wagers involving bread, dried fish, or bits of copper. Nothing extravagant. Most sailors owned very little. Yet games helped long waiting periods pass more comfortably. River travel depended heavily upon weather and currents. Sometimes crews waited days before conditions improved enough for safe movement. During those idle stretches, men repaired equipment, traded stories, played games, sang, and watched the endless activity surrounding the docks. Life near the river never fully stopped. Even deep at night, someone was usually awake loading cargo, preparing boats, cleaning fish, or watching over valuable supplies. The sailors laughed quietly after one fortunate throw. Then conversation drifted back toward ordinary concerns. A sick relative waiting at home. Rumors of taxes increasing farther south. A dangerous sandbank encountered during the last journey. A strange dream seen during fever. Human worries remain the same even thousands of years ago. People carried them into the night and shared them beside lamps, rivers, rooftops, and fires. Near the edge of cultivated farmland where desert began swallowing the earth again, an elderly farmer named Mena sat outside his home polishing a worn wooden tool while listening to crickets. His grandchildren slept nearby beneath linen coverings spread across the roof. Inside the house, his daughter quietly cleaned cooking bowls after supper. Mena worked the smooth cloth across the wood slowly and carefully. He no longer moved quickly. Age had stiffened his knees and bent his shoulders. Yet he enjoyed these peaceful evening tasks. There was satisfaction in caring for familiar objects used through many harvest seasons. Tools carried memory. A fishing net repaired dozens of times. A walking stick worn smooth by years of touch. A clay cup darkened from endless use. Ordinary possessions remained with people for much of their lives. And because objects lasted so long, caring for them became a quiet, meaningful ritual. Mena finished polishing the tool and set it beside the wall. Then he simply sat listening to the night. The wind. The insects. The distant barking of dogs from another village farther down the river. Nothing more. Sometimes entertainment in the ancient world meant allowing the senses to rest gently inside familiar surroundings. No excitement. No urgency. Only presence. As the night moved onward, cooler air finally spread across Egypt. Workers sleeping on rooftops pulled thin blankets closer around their shoulders. Temple flames flickered lower in sheltered courtyards. Boats tied beside docks rose and fell gently against the current. The stars above remained bright and endless. Ancient people spent much of their lives outdoors compared to later societies. They worked outside, traveled outside, rested outside, and often slept outside during hot months. The sky became deeply familiar. Children learned constellations naturally from years of rooftop nights. Sailors depended upon star patterns for navigation. Priests studied heavenly movement carefully for religious calendars and rituals. But ordinary people also simply enjoyed looking upward. A quiet sky after exhausting labor brought comfort. The stars changed slowly. Predictably. Unlike human life. Unlike floods, illness, harvests, or politics. Perhaps that steady movement overhead soothed people living through uncertain times. Near dawn, the eastern horizon slowly began losing its darkness once more. The black sky softened toward deep blue. A few birds stirred among palm trees near the river. Somewhere, a baker's fire crackled awake. Another day prepared itself quietly across ancient Egypt. And through the final peaceful moments before sunrise, countless ordinary people rested beside the Nile after passing another long gentle night with stories, songs, games, memories, conversation, silence, and the soft comforting rhythm of life moving slowly beneath the ancient stars. The first birds began calling softly from the reeds beside the Nile. Their cries drifted through cool blue darkness as dawn slowly approached once again. The stars faded little by little above Egypt, though a few still remained visible over the western desert cliffs where night lingered longer in the shadow of stone hills. Across the villages and cities lining the river, people stirred from sleep. Sleeping mats rustled softly on rooftops. Children rolled closer to their parents against the morning chill. Workers opened tired eyes knowing another long day waited ahead. And before the heat returned, before the shouting markets and crowded riverbanks and endless labor beneath the sun, there existed a short peaceful hour where the world still felt gentle. Many Egyptians treasured this time quietly. The air smelled fresh beside the river. Water jars remained cool from the night. Palm leaves moved softly in the breeze. Even aching bodies felt lighter before work fully began. In a small farming settlement surrounded by onion fields and irrigation canals, a young girl named Sasha followed her grandmother toward the river carrying empty clay jars. The village still rested mostly in silence behind them. Only a few bakers and fishermen were already awake. The old woman walked slowly because of pain in her knees. Sasha matched her pace carefully. Neither spoke very much. There was no need. The sounds around them already filled the morning. Birds moving through reeds. Water touching muddy banks. Sandals brushing softly against dirt paths. Far across the river, a donkey called out once into the pale dawn. When they reached the water, the grandmother paused before filling the jars. She always paused there. Even after thousands of visits across her lifetime. She liked watching the river in the quiet morning light. The surface looked smooth and silver beneath the fading stars. Thin mist floated above the water while fishing boats drifted silently through it like shadows. Sasha stood beside her in silence. Moments like this became part of how people passed time in ancient Egypt. Simply standing near water. Watching. Listening. Breathing cool air before the heat arrived. Modern life often separates entertainment from ordinary existence, but ancient life blurred those boundaries constantly. A peaceful walk to the river could feel meaningful enough on its own. Especially in a world where survival demanded so much physical effort. Back in the village, cooking fires slowly awakened one by one. Smoke rose into brightening sky while women prepared bread dough and men gathered tools for the fields. A boy chased chickens through a dusty lane while his older brother laughed sleepily from a doorway. Nearby, an elderly man already sat outside carving pieces of wood into small animal figures for children. His fingers moved slowly from years of stiffness, yet the tiny carvings emerged carefully shaped and full of life. Simple handmade toys brought quiet happiness to many families. A wooden bird balanced on wheels. A carved cat. A tiny boat. A rag doll stuffed with reeds. Children carried them everywhere until they finally broke apart from use. And when they broke, adults often repaired them patiently instead of throwing them away. Nothing disappeared quickly in the ancient world. Objects remained part of daily life for years. People formed emotional attachments to ordinary things because those things stayed beside them through changing seasons and hardships. Near Memphis, the morning market slowly filled with movement. Merchants spread woven mats across the ground and arranged onions, figs, fish, pottery, sandals, and linen cloth beneath shaded coverings. The smell of fresh bread mixed with mud, sweat, smoke, and river water. Even markets became places of entertainment as much as business. People lingered there. They talked. They listened for rumors. They watched travelers arriving from distant villages. Children wandered wide-eyed between stalls staring at colorful beads or unusual goods carried from foreign lands. An old merchant selling oils and perfumes entertained nearby customers with exaggerated stories about wealthy nobles and difficult clients. His listeners smiled knowingly while pretending to believe every word. The market slowly filled with laughter and conversation. Not loud. Not frantic. Just warm human noise spreading gently beneath the growing sun. For many Egyptians, watching other people became one of life's quiet pleasures. There were no grand performances needed. Ordinary human behavior itself held attention. A clumsy donkey knocking over baskets. A child falling asleep beside vegetables while waiting for a parent. Two merchants arguing softly over grain prices. A traveling sailor describing distant temples farther south. Life unfolded publicly in crowded streets and marketplaces. People observed one another constantly. And because life moved more slowly, even small moments became interesting. As morning advanced, workers traveled toward fields beyond the villages. Farmers carried wooden tools across their shoulders while oxen plodded patiently beside them through dusty paths. The Nile had begun its seasonal changes again. Water levels rose and fell according to rhythms older than memory. Every farmer watched those changes carefully because survival depended upon them completely. During long hours in the fields, entertainment became deeply connected to conversation and rhythm. Workers spoke while planting. They sang while harvesting. They exchanged stories while digging irrigation channels beneath the heavy sun. Silence during labor often felt too exhausting. Human voices helped the hours pass more gently. Near one barley field, a group of farmers worked knee-deep in damp soil while birds circled overhead searching for insects. One younger worker began singing quietly. The melody was simple and repetitive. Soon another voice joined him. Then another. The rhythm of the song matched the steady pace of planting. Step. Bend. Press seeds into mud. Move forward. Repeat. Songs like these were rarely written down. They lived only in memory and changed slightly from village to village over generations. Most disappeared completely with time. Still, for countless workers across ancient Egypt, those songs carried them through difficult days beneath burning skies. By midday, heat settled heavily over the land again. The cool softness of dawn vanished beneath bright crushing sunlight. Workers searched for patches of shade whenever possible. Animals gathered beneath trees. Even the river seemed quieter beneath the harsh afternoon glare. In one workshop near Thebes, several potters rested during the hottest hours while finished clay jars dried outside in the sun. The room smelled strongly of wet clay and smoke. One apprentice sat spinning a tiny broken pottery fragment across the floor like a game while older craftsmen drank water slowly nearby. Another worker scratched little drawings onto discarded clay pieces. Birds. Fish. Funny faces. Tiny boats. These quick playful drawings appeared everywhere in the ancient world. Even exhausted laborers still searched for moments of creativity during long workdays. Humans naturally make art whenever time allows. Not always grand art meant for temples or tombs. Sometimes only little marks left behind during idle moments. One older potter began telling a story about a stubborn customer who once demanded perfectly matching jars even though no handmade work could ever truly match. The others smiled quietly. They had heard the story before. Still, they listened. Stories repeated endlessly across Egyptian life because repetition itself became comforting. Familiar tales created familiarity between people. They reminded listeners that others had lived through similar frustrations, mistakes, fears, and hopes. Outside, cicadas buzzed loudly in the heat. Inside, the potters rested together, letting the afternoon pass slowly around them. Farther south, near a temple complex, musicians practiced inside shaded courtyards while servants swept stone floors nearby. Harp strings vibrated softly through the warm, still air. One young musician struggled repeatedly with a difficult section of melody. Again. 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 An older teacher corrected him patiently without anger. Music required endless repetition, just like every other skill in Egypt. And many people found peace inside that repetition. The steady practice. The familiar movements. The gradual improvement over years rather than days. Ancient life rewarded patience because nearly everything took time. Boats moved slowly. Messages traveled slowly. Buildings rose slowly. Children grew slowly into adulthood beside the same riverbanks where generations before them had also lived and worked. Time itself felt broader. Less crowded. As evening approached once more, shadows lengthened across fields and roads. The worst heat faded. Workers returned home tired and dusty. Cooking fires appeared again above rooftops while warm wind carried the smell of bread and lentils through narrow streets. Children who had spent all afternoon playing beside canals or chasing animals through village lanes slowly wandered back toward home. An old fisherman repaired nets beside his doorway while neighbors gathered nearby. A mother sang softly while washing her daughter's hair. Someone farther away played a quiet flute melody drifting gently through the dusk. And once again, Egypt entered those beloved evening hours when work softened enough for human beings simply to exist together. Near the Nile, several boys floated tiny reed boats through shallow water while watching them drift with the current. The game required nothing more than scraps of papyrus and imagination. Still, they remained completely absorbed. One boat tipped sideways and sank immediately. The others sailed farther into the fading light. The boys laughed softly and built more. Around them, the river reflected gold and red from the setting sun. Birds crossed low over the water. Palm trees darkened against the sky. Nearby adults sat resting after the day's labor, speaking quietly while the evening breeze cooled their skin. No grand event filled the night. No great spectacle. Only ordinary life moving slowly beside the Nile once again. And perhaps for the people living there, that was enough. The sun disappeared slowly behind the western desert, leaving long bands of fading red light across the sky above Egypt. For a few quiet moments, the Nile reflected those colors like polished copper. Palm trees stood dark against the glowing horizon. Birds crossed overhead in slow drifting lines before settling into reeds near the water. Then evening deepened. The heat of the day loosened its grip little by little, and the ancient world exhaled. Workers returning from fields and workshops washed dust from their hands and feet beside canals. Donkeys carrying heavy baskets finally rested. Market sellers lowered woven coverings across their stalls while stray cats wandered through emptying streets searching for scraps of fish or bread. And everywhere across the Nile Valley, families prepared for another long gentle night. In a narrow lane near Thebes, the smell of cooking fires drifted warmly between mud-brick homes. Women baked flat rounds of bread against the hot inner walls of clay ovens while children sat nearby tracing patterns into the dirt with sticks. An old man named Beck spent the evening outside his doorway weaving papyrus reeds into baskets. His hands moved steadily despite their stiffness. Beside him sat his grandson, who kept asking questions about everything. Why birds slept standing up? Why floodwater changed color? Why some stars appeared brighter than others? Beck answered patiently when he could. Sometimes he invented stories instead of explanations. The boy did not seem to mind. Children in ancient Egypt grew up surrounded by oral storytelling. Facts and imagination mixed together naturally in daily conversation. A practical lesson about river safety might slowly become a tale involving spirits hidden among reeds. A warning about crocodiles might transform into stories whispered dramatically beside nighttime fires. Storytelling gave shape to the world. It helped adults teach children while also easing long quiet evenings. The basket weaving continued slowly while darkness settled around them. Nearby neighbors joined the conversation from their own doorways. One woman spoke about her sister recovering from illness. Another complained softly about damaged sandals. Someone mentioned hearing music from a wealthy household near the temple district earlier that afternoon. The discussion wandered gently from one subject to another without direction. No one rushed to finish speaking. Time moved differently after sunset. Without sunlight guiding labor, the night became softer and less measured. Near the riverbanks, fishermen prepared evening meals while boats rocked gently against wooden posts. Their nets hung drying nearby like dark shadows in the moonlight. One younger fisherman played a simple melody on a reed flute while the others listened quietly. The tune rose and fell slowly above the water. No audience gathered. No applause followed. The music existed simply because the night felt large and calm enough to hold it. Many ancient songs were probably never performed formally at all. They belonged instead to work camps, rooftops, kitchens, riverboats, and lonely roads beneath the stars. Ordinary music for ordinary people. Music meant not for performance, but for companionship. The fishermen ate slowly together. Bread dipped in oil. Roasted fish. Beer cooled slightly by the evening air. One man described strange floating lights he once saw far downriver during heavy fog before dawn. Another insisted the lights were spirits traveling above the water. A third laughed softly and blamed too much beer. The conversation drifted onward lazily while insects hummed around the lamps. Nearby, the Nile carried moonlight northward through the darkness. In larger Egyptian homes, evening entertainment sometimes became more organized. Musicians performed in painted courtyards while servants carried trays of figs, wine, roasted duck, and honey cakes between reclining guests. Dancers moved gracefully beneath hanging lamps while perfume drifted through warm night air. Yet even these gatherings retained a calm rhythm compared to modern celebrations. People reclined comfortably for long periods listening to music. Conversations unfolded slowly. Guests played Senet or other board games between songs. Some simply watched entertainers quietly while sipping wine and resting tired bodies. Even among wealthier Egyptians, the night rarely became frantic. Darkness encouraged stillness. Oil lamps only illuminated small spaces. Beyond their glow waited silence and stars. Near one temple town, a group of young workers gathered beside an unfinished wall where they sat sharing stories after supper. They had spent the day hauling limestone beneath brutal heat and now rested with sore shoulders and dusty feet stretched toward a tiny fire. One worker balanced pebbles carefully into small towers before knocking them down again. Another carved lines into a broken pottery shard absent-mindedly while listening. Their oldest companion told stories about years spent working farther south near royal tombs hidden beneath desert cliffs. He described narrow tunnels painted with stars. Long underground chambers glowing by torchlight. The strange silence inside unfinished tombs deep beneath the earth. The younger workers listened closely. Most ordinary Egyptians would never enter such places themselves. Stories carried them there instead. In the ancient world, imagination traveled farther than most bodies ever could. Many people spent their entire lives within a small region along the Nile. They knew nearby villages, fields, canals, and temple roads deeply, but little beyond them. And so travelers became treasured sources of entertainment. Sailors, merchants, temple messengers, caravan guards. Anyone who had seen distant places brought pieces of a larger world back home through stories. Near the delta marshes, an elderly widow named Tamarid passed her evenings feeding scraps of bread to stray cats gathering near her doorway. The cats knew her routine well. As soon as darkness settled, they appeared silently from alleys and rooftops one by one. Tamarid spoke softly to them while they ate. Sometimes she laughed quietly when two animals argued over the same piece. She lived alone now after many years of marriage and motherhood. Most evenings felt quiet inside her small home. Yet caring for the animals gave shape to her nights. Humans have always searched for companionship, even in simple forms. A familiar cat waiting beside the doorway. A neighbor calling softly across a rooftop. The sound of another person breathing nearby while sleeping. These small connections eased loneliness. Farther inland near the edge of the desert, shepherds watched campfires flicker beneath open sky while flocks rested nearby in darkness. The desert night carried a different kind of silence from the river. Drier. Wider. Almost endless. There, entertainment often became deeply reflective because the landscape itself encouraged thought. A shepherd alone beneath stars might spend hours remembering old conversations or imagining future harvests. Travelers crossing long desert roads counted constellations, repeated songs quietly to themselves, or watched changing moonlight across distant dunes. Without distractions, the mind wandered naturally. Sometimes peacefully. Sometimes toward worries. But always slowly. In one small desert camp, two brothers passed time by naming every village they had ever visited along the Nile. The game lasted surprisingly long. Each memory led to another. A ferry crossing remembered from childhood. A market famous for figs. A temple with painted blue ceilings. A village where they once sheltered during a storm. Memory itself became entertainment. People replayed life carefully because new experiences arrived less often. Near midnight, Egypt settled once again toward deep quiet. Cooking fires dimmed. Conversations softened. Most homes fell dark except for occasional lamps glowing behind linen curtains. The river moved steadily through moonlight beside sleeping fields. Inside countless small homes, exhausted workers finally stretched out onto woven mats after another day of labor. Children slept beside parents. Dogs curled near doorways. A few elderly people remained awake listening to insects outside or rubbing oil into aching joints before rest. On rooftops, families lay beneath open sky watching stars drift slowly overhead. And still, scattered across the ancient world, small sounds continued softly through the darkness. The steady scrape of a woman spinning flax into thread. A distant lullaby sung to a restless child. The creak of a boat rope against wood. The murmur of two guards speaking quietly beside temple gates. A lonely flute somewhere across the Nile carried briefly on the wind. Then silence returned again. Wide. Warm. Peaceful. And beneath the endless stars above Egypt, ordinary people continued passing time in the simplest ways humans ever have through stories, songs, memory, companionship, quiet observation, and the gentle comfort of sharing another slow night beside the river. The moon climbed higher over Egypt, pale and calm above the sleeping Nile. Its light touched the tops of temple columns, narrow mudbrick alleys, rooftop sleeping mats, and the quiet water moving endlessly through the dark land. Along the riverbanks, reeds bent softly in the night wind while fishing boats drifted gently against their ropes. Most people had gone to sleep now. The long day of labor had finally pulled tired bodies into rest. Still, the ancient world remained quietly alive in scattered corners beneath the stars. A temple guard walking slowly through torch-lit corridors. A baker kneading dough before dawn. A mother awake beside a sick child. An elderly fisherman staring silently across black water. And in these late peaceful hours, time itself seemed to slow even more. Near Memphis, a young pottery apprentice named Hui sat outside his workshop unable to sleep because of the lingering heat trapped inside the walls. The workshop smelled strongly of clay, smoke, and damp earth. Rows of unfinished jars stood nearby waiting for morning sun to dry them completely. Hui rested against the doorway while shaping a tiny figure from leftover clay. Not for work. Not for sale. Just for himself. His fingers pressed gently into the soft material, slowly forming the shape of a small cat curled beside its paws. The work relaxed him. Many people in ancient Egypt passed time by making small objects with their hands. Humans naturally create things during quiet moments. A carpenter carved tiny animals from wood scraps. A weaver experimented with decorative knot patterns. Children shaped mud figures beside canals while waiting for parents to finish chores. Creativity lived quietly inside ordinary life. Not every act of making needed importance. Sometimes people created simply because the hands wished to move while the mind rested. Across the narrow street, an old woman watered potted plants growing beside her doorway. The water darkened the dusty ground and released the cool earthy smell of wet soil into the night air. She nodded softly toward Hui. He nodded back. Then both returned peacefully to their own silence. Ancient neighborhoods often shared this kind of quiet companionship. People lived close together. Homes stood side by side along narrow lanes where every voice and footstep became familiar over time. Neighbors knew one another's routines deeply. Who woke earliest? Who sang while working? Who coughed through the night? Which families argued loudly? Which children laughed the most? Life unfolded openly in shared spaces. And because of that closeness, even silence felt communal rather than lonely. Farther south near the great temples of Thebes, several musicians remained awake practicing inside a shaded courtyard lit by oil lamps. Their instruments rested against painted walls between songs. A harp. A lute. A reed flute. A small drum worn smooth from years of use. One older musician adjusted strings carefully while younger students repeated the same melody again and again. Practice in the ancient world required patience beyond what many modern people would recognize. Everything depended upon repetition. Musicians repeated notes. Scribes repeated symbols. Farmers repeated seasonal routines. Stoneworkers repeated hammer strikes. Life itself moved in circles more than straight lines. And perhaps because repetition surrounded them constantly, ancient people learned to find comfort within it rather than frustration. The musicians continued practicing slowly into the night. Outside the courtyard walls, the city slept. Only distant dogs barking near the river interrupted the soft music drifting upward beneath the stars. Near the Nile Delta marshes, two boys remained awake far past bedtime while sitting beside their uncle repairing fishing nets. The boys were supposed to help. Instead, they mostly asked questions. Their uncle answered patiently while his fingers moved steadily through the tangled rope. He explained how to recognize dangerous currents by watching water patterns. How certain birds revealed where fish gathered beneath the surface. How the river smelled different before storms. The boys listened carefully. Children in ancient Egypt learned most skills simply by staying near adults long enough to observe them repeatedly. Formal teaching existed mainly for scribes and priests. Ordinary knowledge passed naturally through daily life. And during long evening tasks, conversation flowed easily beside shared work. The uncle eventually began telling the boys about his first fishing trip as a child many years earlier. He described his fear of deep water, the excitement of catching his first fish, and the embarrassment of falling into the Nile while trying to pull in a heavy net. The boys laughed softly. The story had become family memory now, repeated many times over the years. Still, everyone enjoyed hearing it again. Repetition gave stories warmth. Each retelling carried familiarity like an old blanket used through many winters. Near one farming village, several elderly men gathered outside a grain storage building where cooler night air drifted across the fields. None of them worked heavily anymore. Age had stiffened their joints and weakened their backs after decades of labor. Now they mostly watched younger generations continue the same work they themselves had once performed beneath the sun. One old farmer slowly polished a walking stick while another rubbed oil into swollen hands. Their conversation moved gently through old memories. Flood seasons from long ago. Harvests ruined by insects. Children now grown into adults. Neighbors already dead. Old age in ancient Egypt often meant spending more time remembering than planning. Life expectancy remained short for many workers, and those who survived into old age carried enormous amounts of memory compared to younger people around them. They became keepers of the past. And during long peaceful nights, younger relatives often sat nearby listening to those memories unfold slowly beneath the stars. The old men fell quiet for several moments. Nobody hurried to speak. The night itself filled the silence comfortably. Crickets sang in the grass. A donkey shifted somewhere nearby. The wind carried faint smells of grain and river mud through the darkness. Then one of the men quietly began humming an old work song from his youth. The others smiled softly. Soon another voice joined him. Then another. The melody moved slowly through the warm night air. Simple. Steady. Familiar. Near a wealthy estate north of Memphis, servants finished cleaning after an evening gathering. The guests had already departed through torch-lit streets while musicians packed away instruments beneath painted columns. Now the household grew quiet again. A young servant girl sat briefly beside the kitchen doorway massaging tired feet before returning to work. Nearby, another servant carefully wrapped leftover food in cloth while speaking softly about the evening. They described elegant clothing worn by noble guests. The beautiful music. The smell of expensive perfume drifting through the courtyard. For servants, observing wealthy life often became its own strange form of entertainment. They watched celebrations from the edges while continuing their duties quietly. Sometimes they later repeated stories about those gatherings to friends and relatives back home. Small details fascinated listeners. Gold jewelry. Imported wine. Exotic animals. Lavish foods rarely tasted by ordinary people. Stories allowed poorer workers brief glimpses into worlds they would never inhabit themselves. Near midnight, cooler wind finally spread across the Nile Valley. Families sleeping on rooftops pulled thin blankets closer around their shoulders. Palm leaves rustled softly. The river reflected moonlight in long broken lines moving steadily northward. Inside one modest riverside home, a young mother rocked her restless child beside a dim lamp. The baby would not sleep. So she began singing softly. Not loudly. Almost whispering. The melody moved gently through the room while shadows flickered across the mud brick walls. Outside, everything remained still. The song drifted into the night where no audience waited except the sleepy child in her arms. Yet moments like this formed part of the hidden emotional life of ancient Egypt. Quiet songs sung in darkness. Private conversations between exhausted spouses. Children falling asleep during stories. Elderly people sitting awake listening to insects while remembering younger years. These small unseen moments matter just as much as the temples and monuments history remembers more easily. The ordinary human experience unfolded mostly in silence away from grand events. Near the western desert cliffs, workers guarding unfinished royal tombs sat beside a low fire while staring toward the dark hills surrounding them. The cliffs looked enormous beneath moonlight. Cold and ancient. One guard entertained the others by trying to imitate the voices of important officials who visited the work site during daytime inspections. The men laughed quietly. Even in difficult lives, people searched gently for humor now and then. Not loud comedy. Not wild excitement. Just small moments easing tension during long nights. Eventually the laughter faded. The guards returned to staring into the fire. Above them, countless stars stretched across the sky. The desert wind moved softly through dry stone valleys. Far away beyond the cliffs, the Nile continued its endless journey through sleeping Egypt. And throughout the ancient land, ordinary people rested, talked quietly, remembered old stories, sang familiar songs, played simple games, watched the stars, and let another peaceful night carry them slowly toward sleep beside the timeless river. The night drifted onward softly over the Nile Valley. Above Egypt, the stars remained bright and countless, scattered across the dark sky like grains of silver dust. The moonlight rested quietly on temple roofs, empty market roads, sleeping animals, and calm river water moving endlessly north through the darkness. The air had finally cooled. After the heavy heat of the day, people breathed easier now. Rooftops filled with sleeping families wrapped loosely in linen cloth. In narrow alleys, dogs curled beside doorways while cats slipped silently across walls hunting insects near fading lamps. And through all this stillness, life continued gently in small hidden ways. Near a riverside village, a young woman named Izet sat awake beside her grandmother weaving strands of flax into thread. The work moved slowly in the dim light. Their fingers twisted and pulled the fibers with practiced care while the rest of the household slept nearby. Izet was tired. Her shoulders ached from carrying water earlier that afternoon. Her hands still felt rough from washing clothing beside the riverbank. But she liked these quiet nighttime hours beside her grandmother. The older woman always spoke more softly at night, as though darkness itself encouraged memory. Tonight she described the village as it had looked many years earlier when she herself had been young. Different houses. Different neighbors. Different trees growing beside the canal. She spoke about flood seasons long past and harvest celebrations no longer remembered by most people. Izet listened while continuing her weaving. Ancient people spent much of their leisure time listening to older generations describe vanished years. In a world where written history belonged mostly to scribes and priests, ordinary memory became precious. Villages changed slowly, but they still changed. People died. Children grew. Fields shifted after floods. Homes collapsed and were rebuilt. And the elderly carried knowledge of those gradual transformations inside their minds. Many nights passed this way across Egypt. Young people learning family history beside lamplight while older voices moved patiently through the past. Outside the house, wind rustled through date palms near the river. The grandmother paused for several moments, staring toward the doorway as though listening to sounds only she remembered. Then she quietly resumed speaking. Near Memphis, Several laborers returning late from unloading cargo boats rested beside the docks after their work finally ended. Their bodies looked heavy with exhaustion. Dust clung to sweaty skin. Their backs hurt from lifting grain sacks and pottery jars hour after hour. Still, none of them wanted to sleep immediately. The river at night felt too peaceful to leave quickly. So they sat together beside the water drinking beer from clay cups while lanterns reflected softly on the Nile. One man skipped pieces of broken pottery across the surface. Another stretched aching legs while humming under his breath. Nearby, tide boats creaked gently against wooden posts. Long pauses settled naturally between conversations. Nobody felt uncomfortable inside silence. Modern life often teaches people to fill every quiet moment. Ancient life allowed emptiness to remain empty. And within that emptiness, human attention softened. A man could sit beside water for half an hour simply watching moonlight move with the current. A woman could spend an evening braiding thread while listening to insects outside the walls. A child could stare at flames inside a cooking fire without growing restless immediately. Time unfolded more slowly. And because of that, ordinary moments carried more weight. Farther south near Thebes, musicians performed quietly inside the courtyard of a wealthy home where guests still lingered after supper. Servants moved silently between low tables carrying wine, figs, and small dishes of roasted fish. Perfumed oil burned inside bronze lamps, filling the warm air with sweet fragrance. The music itself remained gentle. Soft harp notes. Low flute melodies. Slow steady drum rhythms. Guests reclined against cushions speaking quietly while musicians played beneath painted columns. No one hurried the evening forward. Wealthy Egyptians often treated nighttime as a space for lingering rather than excitement. Conversation wandered slowly. Games unfolded patiently. Poetry was recited line by line beneath torchlight while listeners relaxed into the rhythm of the words. Even luxury moved calmly in the ancient world. Outside the estate walls, ordinary workers passed through dark streets carrying water jars or returning home after late duties. They heard faint music drifting through the night and continued walking beneath the stars. Music traveled far after dark. Near one temple complex, several priests remained awake studying star positions from the roof of a sacred building. The heavens held enormous importance in Egyptian religious life. Priests carefully observed the movement of constellations, planets, and seasonal stars to guide ceremonies and calendars. Yet even beyond religion, the night sky fascinated ordinary people deeply. Without smoke and artificial lights hiding the stars, the heavens appeared immense and alive above Egypt. Children learned star patterns early. Boatmen navigated using them. Travelers followed them through the desert. Elderly people rested on rooftops staring upward for hours during hot seasons. The sky became part of everyday life. One young priest studying beside his teacher yawned heavily while trying to remain focused on the stars overhead. The older priest smiled faintly and handed him cool water. Then both returned to their observations in silence. Nearby temple fires glowed dimly against towering stone walls carved with images of gods, birds, and kings. The entire city around them slept. Only the stars remained endlessly awake. Near a cluster of farming homes beside irrigation canals, children who should have been asleep whispered together on a rooftop while adults rested nearby. One boy pointed toward shadows moving near the fields and insisted they were spirits wandering beside the water. Another claimed they were only goats. A third quietly told a story about hidden creatures living beneath the Nile during flood season. Children everywhere create mystery from darkness. Ancient Egyptian children were no different. The night encouraged imagination. Shapes shifted strangely beneath moonlight. Sounds carried unpredictably through reeds and empty streets. Stories about spirits, gods, wandering souls, and sacred animals blended naturally into childhood games and fears. Eventually one child became too sleepy to continue speaking and drifted asleep mid-conversation. The others grew quiet soon after. Above them, the stars turned slowly across the sky. In one small village near the desert edge, a widow named Mutimwia spent part of every evening sitting outside her doorway spinning wool while watching travelers pass along a nearby road. Most nights few people appeared. A merchant leading donkeys. A tired farmer returning late. An occasional temple messenger carrying documents between towns. Still, she liked observing them. Watching strangers briefly enter and leave the quiet darkness gave shape to her evenings. Human beings naturally become observers when life moves slowly enough. Ancient people spent long periods simply watching the world around them. Birds gathering near marshes. Workers returning from fields. Clouds drifting above cliffs. Boats disappearing into evening mist. Observation itself became a kind of peaceful pastime. Mutimwia paused her spinning when she saw a small caravan approaching through the moonlight. The travelers looked exhausted. Dust covered their clothing and animals after long days crossing dry roads beside the river. One traveler greeted her politely while asking where they might find water before resting. She pointed them toward a nearby well. Then the road became quiet again. The widow resumed spinning thread while insects hummed around a lamp beside her. Far away across Egypt, countless similar moments unfolded silently through the night. A fisherman teaching knots to his son beside the river. An elderly couple sharing figs on a rooftop beneath cool wind. A lonely guard tracing patterns in dust while watching temple gates. A baker kneading dough before dawn while humming softly to himself. A group of workers playing senet beside a fading fire. A mother soothing nightmares with old stories whispered in darkness. History often remembers kings, monuments, battles, and temples. But most human life existed elsewhere. In ordinary evenings. In shared silence. In tired conversations after work. In songs carried softly through warm night air. Near midnight once more, Egypt settled deeper into stillness. The lamps burned lower. Voices faded. The river continued moving patiently beneath moonlight while palm leaves rustled gently beside the shore. And under the endless ancient sky, ordinary people kept passing the quiet hours the only ways humans truly ever have through memory, companionship, music, storytelling, small handmade games, careful observation, and the comforting rhythm of simply being together beside the Nile. A soft wind moved across the Nile sometime after midnight. It slipped through reeds along the riverbanks, crossed sleeping fields, and wandered gently through narrow streets where oil lamps had nearly burned out. The warm stones of temple courtyards slowly released the heat gathered during the day, and above everything stretched the wide dark sky filled with silent stars. Egypt rested quietly beneath it. Most homes had fallen completely still now. Children slept deeply beside parents on woven mats spread across rooftops. Dogs twitched softly in dreams near doorways. Cooking fires glowed faintly beneath layers of ash while the smell of smoke lingered low in the night air. Yet even in the deepest hours before dawn, some people remained awake. Ancient life never fully stopped. Near a riverside bakery in Memphis, a man named Painasi was already working by lamplight preparing dough for the morning bread. The bakery felt warm despite the cooler night outside. Flour dust floated through the air while large clay ovens radiated leftover heat from earlier baking. Painasi kneaded the heavy dough slowly and steadily, pressing it forward with tired hands hardened from years of labor. He had worked nights for much of his life. While others slept, bakers quietly prepared the next day for the city. And during these lonely hours, many workers developed small private routines to pass time gently. Painasi often spoke softly to himself while working. Not full conversations. Only scattered thoughts drifting aloud into the warm darkness. Memories. Bits of songs. Plans for repairing his roof after flood season. Complaints about sore knees. The empty bakery listened silently. People who worked alone frequently created companionship from their own voices, songs, or familiar habits. A fisherman humming beside the river. A shepherd talking quietly to animals. A woman singing while grinding grain before dawn. The sound of human speech softened loneliness. Outside the bakery, the streets remained nearly empty. Only a few distant footsteps echoed occasionally between mud-brick walls. Somewhere farther away, a baby cried briefly before falling quiet again. The city slept beneath the stars. Near Thebes, a small group of stone workers rested beside unfinished tomb entrances carved into desert cliffs. They had spent weeks helping widen burial chambers beneath the mountains west of the Nile. The work exhausted them completely. Dust coated their skin. Their shoulders remained sore from carrying tools up steep rocky paths. Still, tonight they stayed awake longer than usual because one older worker had begun telling stories from his youth. The men sat beside a low fire while the desert stretched silently around them. The storyteller described traveling once with a caravan far south where strange birds walked beside the river and the heat felt so intense that even nighttime air remained warm. The younger workers listened closely. Most had never traveled far from their villages. The story carried them elsewhere for a while. This was one of the quiet powers of storytelling in the ancient world. Stories allowed ordinary people to experience distant places without ever leaving home. A merchant's tale could transport listeners across deserts. A sailor's memory could carry them downriver through unfamiliar cities. A temple singer could bring ancient gods alive through words alone. And because entertainment remained largely oral, imagination grew strong from constant listening. The fire crackled softly while the storyteller continued. Above the workers, the desert sky looked endless. No city lights hid the stars. The cliffs stood pale beneath moonlight like enormous sleeping shapes watching over the valley below. Far across the Nile, tiny scattered lamps marked villages resting beside dark water. Near one farming settlement farther north, a mother named Tiaa sat awake weaving linen while her infant slept nearby. The child had been ill earlier in the evening, and though the fever had faded, Tiaa remained too worried to sleep comfortably herself. So she worked quietly by the doorway listening to the sounds outside. Crickets. Wind. The soft splash of water against canal walls. Weaving calmed her mind. Many ancient tasks carried this soothing repetitive quality. The body moved in familiar rhythms while thought slowly settled. Thread passed through fingers. Fibers tightened. Patterns formed little by little. Time softened. Nearby, her elderly father slept lightly on the roof above. Occasionally he coughed in his sleep before the night returned to silence again. Family life in ancient Egypt often unfolded close together across generations. Grandparents, parents, children, cousins, and relatives shared limited spaces and heard nearly every part of one another's lives. Privacy existed differently then. People rarely spent long periods truly alone. And because of this closeness, companionship became woven naturally into ordinary existence. Even quiet tasks usually happened beside someone else breathing, speaking, sleeping, or working nearby. Near the Nile Delta marshes, fishermen waiting for dawn passed time mending nets beneath hanging lanterns. The lantern light reflected softly on wet rope and dark water while insects gathered around the flames. One fisherman quietly challenged another to a game using carved knuckle bones tossed onto a folded cloth. The others watched with sleepy interest. Small games like these filled waiting periods across ancient life. Simple objects. Simple rules. Endless repetition. Games helped workers endure stretches of uncertainty when weather, river currents, or timing prevented immediate labor. A ferryman waiting for passengers. Sailors delayed by wind. Farmers resting during midday heat. Guards surviving long nighttime watches. Games gave shape to empty hours. One fisherman lost several throws in a row and groaned quietly while the others laughed beneath their breath. The laughter faded quickly back into comfortable silence. No one felt pressure to entertain constantly. Moments of activity rose naturally from stillness and then dissolved back into it again. Farther south, priests inside a temple complex prepared quietly for the first rituals before sunrise. They moved through dark halls carrying oil lamps that flickered against painted walls covered in sacred images. The temple smelled of incense, stone dust, old smoke, and cool night air drifting through open courtyards. One young priest paused briefly beside a reflecting pool inside the temple grounds. The water mirrored the stars overhead almost perfectly. For a long moment he simply stood there watching the reflection move gently with the wind. Ancient people often paused during ordinary routines to observe beauty carefully. Moonlight on water. Birds lifting from reeds. Sunlight touching temple walls at dawn. The smell of rain after dry heat. Without endless distraction, small details became emotionally important. Life contained hardship everywhere: illness, labor, hunger, injury, uncertainty, yet moments of quiet beauty still appeared constantly beside the Nile. And people noticed them. Near Memphis, a pair of brothers slept lightly on a rooftop while nearby neighbors continued whispering long after midnight. The brothers pretended not to listen, though they heard nearly every word drifting through the warm darkness. A discussion about taxes. Someone's upcoming marriage. A missing donkey. A cousin returning from military service farther south. Neighborhood conversations traveled easily through nighttime air. Entire communities remained loosely connected through shared sound. Children learned adult concerns simply by overhearing them year after year. Older people knew which households argued often and which homes stayed unusually quiet. Voices carried stories through the dark long before written messages reached ordinary people. One brother eventually rolled over and stared upward toward the stars. He tried counting them for a while before losing track repeatedly. Then he began tracing familiar constellations learned during childhood. Boat patterns. Animal shapes. Sacred symbols. The sky itself became entertainment for countless ancient people. It changed slowly enough to study carefully night after night across an entire lifetime. Near the edge of cultivated land where desert sand slowly reclaimed the earth, a lonely watchman sat beside a small fire guarding grain storage buildings. His job required staying awake until dawn. To pass the hours, he carved tiny figures into scraps of wood using a bronze knife worn smooth with age. Little birds. Tiny dogs. Simple boats. When he finished one carving, he placed it carefully into a cloth pouch beside him. Perhaps they were gifts for children. Perhaps he simply enjoyed making them. The firelight flickered across his tired face while wind moved softly over the empty fields around him. The watchman yawned and listened to the enormous silence stretching beyond the farms toward the dark desert. Then somewhere far away, a rooster called once into the night. Another answered. The eastern sky remained dark, but dawn was slowly approaching once again. Another day prepared itself quietly across ancient Egypt. And through the final peaceful hours before sunrise, ordinary people continued passing time beside the Nile with songs, stories, careful work, soft conversations, games played by lantern light, quiet observation, and the deep comforting presence of other human lives moving gently beside their own. Now the night along the Nile has grown very still. The last lamps burn softly behind quiet windows of mud-brick homes. Cooking fires have faded into warm red embers. The marketplaces rest empty beneath the moon, and the dusty roads that carried so many tired footsteps through the day now lie silent beneath drifting night wind. Far across the river, reeds sway gently in darkness. The water continues its endless slow journey northward, carrying moonlight upon its surface just as it did thousands of years ago. And all across ancient Egypt, ordinary people have finally fallen asleep. The fishermen beside their folded nets. The farmers resting sore bodies after long hours in flooded fields. The bakers waiting for another dawn. The children curled beside parents beneath open skies. The old storytellers whose voices slowly faded into silence beside the fire. The musicians. The boatmen. The servants. The shepherds watching stars above the desert. All of them resting now beneath the same quiet sky. The temples stand silent in the darkness. Tall stone columns glow faintly beneath the pale moon while cool wind drifts through empty courtyards where footsteps echoed earlier in the day. Beyond them stretch sleeping villages, peaceful canals, dark palm trees, and endless fields waiting for morning light. The night feels soft here. Slow. Unhurried. And somewhere beside the Nile, hidden among reeds and gentle river mist, the ancient world keeps breathing quietly through the darkness. A distant owl calls once. Water touches the shore. Then silence returns again. The stars continue moving slowly overhead. The warm desert wind drifts softly across rooftops where families sleep beneath linen blankets. And history itself seems to grow quiet at last. So now, let the river carry everything gently away. The sounds of labor. The crowded markets. The songs drifting through workshops. The stories whispered beside cooking fires. The footsteps on dusty roads. All fading slowly into the peaceful Egyptian night. And as the Nile flows endlessly beneath the moonlight, the ancient world grows calmer, softer, quieter. Until only the stillness remains. And sleep comes gently at last.